The stars rippled. Doroni felt the familiar sensation of hyperspace translation through the deck plates of the Retribution's edge as reality reasserted itself around the super frigate. The transition always made her stomach lurch, a peculiar reminder that even the most advanced Forshim technology couldn't entirely eliminate the physical cost of tearing through the fabric of space-time itself. Through the reinforced transparency of the weapons bay, she watched the red dwarf star of the Georgia Nestor system paint everything in crimson light, its dying radiance casting long shadows across the massive semicircular hull of her ship. "Translation complete, Weapons Officer Doroni," announced Captain Jitara from the command bridge above. The captain's voice carried through the ship's comm system with the crisp authority that had earned her command of one of the colony's most decorated super frigates. At 47 cycles old, Jitara was considered young for a ship commander, but her tactical brilliance in the Andromeda campaigns had marked her as one of the rising stars in the colonial fleet. "Begin sensor sweep of the engagement zone." Doroni's clawed fingers danced across the targeting console with practiced precision, each movement economical and deadly. Her forearms moved in perfect coordination, a genetic gift that made her species natural warriors and strategists. Each of her 8 digits was tipped with a neural interface that allowed direct connection to the ship's weapons systems, turning her into an extension of the Retribution's edge itself. The ship was 556 canarths of pure destruction, its semicircular hull bristling with plasma cannons, particle beam arrays, and the feared molecular disruptors that could tear apart matter at the quantum level. 2 bridge constructs jutted forward and above the main disk like predatory eyes, while the massive engineering section below pulsed with the contained fury of zero-point energy reactors. "Sensors active, Captain," Doroni reported, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a predator spotting prey. Her golden eyes, evolved from millennia of hunting in the twilight worlds of the Forshim home cluster, swept across the holographic displays that materialized around her station. "Beginning tactical assessment of human defensive positions." The data flowed across her displays in streams of glowing text and 3-dimensional tactical projections, each piece of intelligence processed by combat algorithms refined over 1,000 years of galactic conquest. Around the Retribution's edge, space itself seemed to birth an armada as ship after ship of the Forshim colonial fleet emerged from hyperspace. The sight never failed to fill Doroni with pride for her species' overwhelming might, and righteous fury at those who dared oppose the First Mother's will. Capital ships the size of small worlds materialized in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the adaptive armor that had never failed them in conquest after conquest. Each vessel was a testament to Forshim engineering prowess, their surfaces rippling with energy fields that could absorb and redirect incoming weapons fire. The Eternal Dominion, flagship of the assault fleet, dwarfed even these giants, a mobile fortress stretching nearly 2,000 canarths from bow to stern, its surface bristling with enough firepower to glass entire continents. Moon-sized carriers disgorged clouds of fighters like angry insects, their sleek forms cutting through the void with predatory grace. Each fighter was piloted by a Forshim warrior at the peak of her combat conditioning, her reflexes enhanced by neural implants and battle stims that allowed reaction times measured in microseconds. The carriers themselves were marvels of military engineering, their vast hangar bays capable of housing hundreds of thousands of attack craft while maintaining full defensive capability. Destroyers and frigates took their positions in the battle line with mechanical precision, their formations practiced through countless fleet exercises and proven in the fires of galactic war. The sight of so many ships moving in perfect harmony was breathtaking. A symphony of destruction orchestrated by tactical computers and executed by warriors who had never known defeat. The fleet stretched across the outer rim of the Georgia Nestor system, a wall of technological supremacy that had crushed resistance in 14 different galaxies. Doroni's enhanced vision could make out the distant glints of human vassals fleeing toward the inner system, their crude fusion drives leaving bright trails against the cosmic dark. 2 septillion humans spread across their corner of the galaxy, breeding like vermin. Their exponential population growth threatening to outnumber the Forshim within mere centuries if left unchecked. The year 3400 by their primitive calendar would mark the beginning of their end. "Praise the First Mother," Doroni whispered, watching the tactical display populate with friendly contacts. 136,495 capital ships, millions of carriers, trillions of escort vessels, and this represented only 70% of the colonial fleet's strength. The humans had chosen to make their stand here, in this remote system with its 5 inner rocky worlds and sparse asteroid belts. They would learn why the Forshim had never known defeat, why their empire spanned galaxies while human civilization was confined to a single spiral arm. The red dwarf's light caught the hull of a nearby battlecruiser, its surface etched with victory markings that told the story of worlds conquered and species subjugated. Each mark represented a civilization that had once thought itself mighty, only to discover the futility of opposing the First Mother's children. Soon, humanity would join that long list of the defeated. "Weapons officer, report," Captain Jitara commanded. Doroni's secondary arms worked the targeting computers while her primary hands managed the firing solutions. "Captain, sensors detect human fleet movement near the 4th planet. They appear to be withdrawing." A moment of silence filled the bridge communications. Then Captain Jitara's laughter echoed through the ship's corridors, quickly joined by the amused chittering of the 92,000 troops aboard the Retribution's Edge. "Withdrawing already?" The captain's voice dripped with contempt. "And here intelligence reported they were a fierce species. Doroni, what are our numbers on the human fleet?" Doroni's ears flicked back as she processed the sensor data. "Reading approximately 500 billion vessels of military classification, Captain. An additional 2.2 trillion converted civilian craft. The smaller attack craft number roughly 92 trillion. She paused, her golden eyes focusing on an unusual reading. "Captain, they possess several extremely large vessels they appear to classify as battleships. Each measures approximately 400 k'narths in length." 400 k'narths? The captain's amusement was palpable. "Barely larger than our frigates. These humans truly don't understand the scale of warfare, do they?" Through the weapons bay's observation ports, Doroni could see the human fleet in the distance, their formations breaking apart as they retreated toward the inner system. Their ships were crude things, all sharp angles and visible weapon emplacements, lacking the elegant curves and seamless armor of Forshim engineering. Most appeared to be fusion-powered, a technology the Forshim had abandoned 3 millennia ago in favor of zero-point energy extraction. "Fleet command to all vessels," came the voice of Fleet Admiral Rathard across the tactical network. "Human forces are withdrawing to defensive positions around the 4th planet. All capital ships are to advance to engagement range. Carriers will launch all fighter wings. The humans wish to make their final stand behind their primitive orbital fortifications." Doroni's muzzle wrinkled in what her species considered a smile. The humans had built their defenses around the 4th planet, a barren rock with no strategic value beyond its position in the system. They would die there, clustered around their pathetic stronghold, while the might of the Forshim colonial fleet demonstrated once again why resistance was futile. 2 septillion of them, spread across their corner of this galaxy, breeding like vermin, threatening to outnumber the Forshim if left The year 3400 by their primitive calendar would mark the end of their exponential expansion. "Weapon systems charging, Captain," Doroni reported. "Plasma cannons at 60% and climbing, molecular disruptors online, particle beam arrays cycling to full power." "Excellent. Signal the fleet we advance as one. Today, these humans learn why the First Mother's children have never known defeat." Captain Jitara's voice carried the fervor of absolute faith. "For the colony and for the First Mother. For the First Mother," Doroni echoed, along with every voice aboard the ship. The Forshim fleet began its advance, a tide of destruction rolling inexorably toward the retreating humans. In the red light of Georgia Nestor's dying star, the greatest armada in galactic history moved to claim another victory in the name of the First Mother. The humans continued to fall back, their formations increasingly scattered as they fled toward their doomed defensive positions. Durrani watched them run and felt only contempt. These creatures had been granted the honor of facing the Forshim in open battle, and they chose cowardice instead. They would learn their mistakes soon enough. The Forshim armada swept through the outer system like a tide of destruction, maintaining perfect formation as they advanced past the sparse outer asteroid belt. The three gas giants hung in their orbits like bloated sentinels, their roiling atmospheres painted crimson by the red dwarf's light. "Fleet Admiral Rathart to all vessels," the voice crackled across the tactical network. "Maintain combat spacing. Intelligence suggests the humans may have seeded the system with defensive platforms." Durrani's ears perked forward as she monitored her sensor displays. "Captain, I'm detecting minimal energy signatures from the gas giants. Some metallic debris in their upper atmospheres, but nothing that registers as active weaponry." "Typical human desperation," Captain Jatara replied dismissively, "hiding their pathetic defenses in gas clouds like scavengers." The fleet pressed forward, capital ships leading the advance with their moon-sized escorts flanking in precise formation. Durrani watched the tactical display with satisfaction as over 100,000 planet-sized vessels moved in perfect synchronization, a testament to Forshim naval superiority. Then the first gas giant erupted. Automated defense platforms burst from the churning clouds like angry wasps, their primitive fusion drives flaring as they accelerated toward the Forshim vanguard. Crude missile batteries and particle beam arrays opened fire, sending streams of energy and projectiles toward the advancing fleet. "All vessels, defensive fire," Fleet Admiral Rathart commanded. "Eliminate these gnats." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Plasma cannons from 1,000 ships lit the void, turning the attacking platforms into expanding clouds of superheated gas and molten metal. Molecular disruptors tore apart matter at the quantum level, leaving nothing but dissipating energy signatures. "Pitiful," Durrani muttered, watching the last of the automated defenses die under the Forshim barrage. "Is this truly the best these humans can?" The words died in her throat as something impossible happened. The Forshim armada swept through the outer system like a tide of destruction, maintaining perfect formation as they advanced past the sparse outer asteroid belt. The three gas giants hung in their orbits like bloated sentinels, their roiling atmospheres painted crimson by the red dwarf's light. "Fleet Admiral Rathart to all vessels," the voice crackled across the tactical network. "Maintain combat spacing. Intelligence suggests the humans may have seeded the system with defensive platforms." Durrani's ears perked forward as she monitored her sensor displays. "Captain, I'm detecting minimal energy signatures from the gas giants. Some metallic debris in their upper atmospheres, but nothing that registers as active weaponry." "Typical human desperation," Captain Jatara replied dismissively, "hiding their pathetic defenses in gas clouds like scavengers." The fleet pressed forward, capital ships leading the advance, with their moon-sized escorts flanking in precise formation. Durrani watched the tactical display with satisfaction as over 100,000 planet-sized vessels moved in perfect synchronization, a testament to Forshim naval superiority. Then, the first gas giant erupted. Automated defense platforms burst from the churning clouds like angry wasps, their primitive fusion drives flaring as they accelerated toward the Forshim vanguard. Crude missile batteries and particle beam arrays opened fire, sending streams of energy and projectiles toward the advancing fleet. "All vessels, defensive fire," Fleet Admiral Rathart commanded. "Eliminate these gnats." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Plasma cannons from 1,000 ships lit the void, turning the attacking platforms into expanding clouds of superheated gas and molten metal. Molecular disruptors tore apart matter at the quantum level, leaving nothing but dissipating energy signatures. Pitiful, Durrani muttered, watching the last of the automated defenses die under the Forshim barrage. Is this truly the best these humans can... The words died in her throat as something impossible happened. A beam of coherent energy, wider than most Forshim destroyers and blazing with the intensity of a newborn star, lanced out from the depths of the gas giant's atmosphere. It struck the capital ship Mother's Wrath, a vessel the size of a planet, protected by adaptive armor that had never failed in a millennium of warfare. The Mother's Wrath erupted in a catastrophic chain reaction that defied comprehension. The planet-sized hull split apart like a cracked egg, spewing clouds of burning atmosphere and vaporized fuel into the void. Massive sections of the ship tumbled away in slow motion, their surfaces glowing white, hot as internal fires consumed oxygen reserves and life support systems. The vessel's zero-point reactors went critical simultaneously, adding their fury to the destruction as they tore apart the quantum fabric of space itself. What had been the pride of the Forshim fleet became an expanding sphere of burning debris, loose atoms and twisted metal shrapnel that sparkled like deadly stars in the red dwarf's light. For a heartbeat, the silence across the fleet communications was absolute. Durrani stared at her tactical display, her golden eyes wide with disbelief. Where moments before a massive capital ship had dominated the sensor grid, now there was only a growing cloud of superheated plasma and debris, the scattered remains of 9 billion Forshim warriors who had believed themselves invincible. "Impossible," Captain Jitara whispered, her voice barely audible over the comm system. "Fleet Admiral," came a panicked voice from one of the escort vessels. "The Mother's Wrath is gone. Complete destruction. No survivors detected." The shock rippled through the armada like a physical wave. On every ship, in every weapons bay and command center, Forshim warriors stared at their displays in stunned silence. A capital ship, destroyed. Not damaged, not disabled, but utterly annihilated in a single strike. It had been over 1,000 years since the Forshim had lost anything larger than a scout vessel. "Target that gas giant." Fleet Admiral Rathart's voice cut through the stunned silence, cold with fury. "All capital ships, focus fire, eliminate it." The response was swift and merciless. Planet-killer weapons that had reduced entire worlds to ash turned their attention to the offending gas giant. Gravitational warheads tore at its core, while zero-point energy projectors unraveled matter itself. The gas giant's atmosphere ignited under the assault, its churning clouds becoming a hellscape of burning plasma. Within moments, the entire celestial body was gone, scattered into an expanding nebula of superheated gas and burning debris that painted the system in shades of orange and red. "Target eliminated," reported the fleet's sensor operator, her voice shaking slightly. "Complete planetary destruction confirmed." But the damage was done. Across the armada, the impossible had become reality. A Forshim capital ship, pride of the fleet, symbol of their invincibility, had been destroyed by these primitive humans. "All vessels, maintain formation," Fleet Admiral Rathard commanded. Though Durrani could hear the strain in her voice, "Continue the advance. One lucky shot changes nothing." "For the First Mother." "For the First Mother," came the response from across the fleet, but the words lacked their usual fervor. Durrani's claws tightened on her weapon controls as the armada pressed forward through the burning remnants of the gas giant. Around her, the other weapons officers worked with mechanical precision, but she could see the doubt in their eyes, hear it in the subdued chatter of the crew. The humans had drawn first blood. For the first time in over a millennium, the Forshim had truly bled. The advance continued, but something fundamental had changed. The aura of invincibility that had carried them through 14 galaxies of conquest had been cracked, and everyone in the fleet knew it. Then the communications array crackled to life with an incoming transmission. "Attention, Forshim fleet," came a voice across all channels, a voice that was unmistakably, impossibly wrong. deep and resonant in a way that no proper warrior's voice should be. The tone carried the confidence of someone accustomed to absolute authority, yet the timbre was fundamentally alien to Forshim understanding. "This is Grand Admiral Odysseus Charles of the Human Defense Fleet, also known to some as Grand Admiral Tarkin. I am speaking to you from the bridge of the battleship Indomitable Will." The weapons bay fell silent around Doroni. Her ears flicked back in confusion and disgust as her mind struggled to process what she was hearing. The voice was male, definitely undeniably male. The vocal cords were too thick, the resonance too deep, the inflection patterns all wrong for a proper female warrior. But that was impossible. Males were drones, weak creatures whose only purpose was reproduction before their inevitable death. They didn't command fleets. They didn't even leave the breeding colonies. They certainly didn't speak to warriors as equals. Across the weapons bay, she could see her fellow crew members exchanging looks of bewildered disgust. Weapons specialist Canif actually recoiled from her console, as if the male voice had physically contaminated it. Technical Officer Naranuk's ears lay flat against her skull, her lips curled in revulsion. "The destruction of your capital ship was what we call a warning shot," the voice continued with infuriating calm, each word delivered with the measured confidence of someone who believed himself in complete control of the situation. "A shot across the bow, as it were. I wanted to demonstrate that your reputation for invincibility is somewhat exaggerated." The casual dismissal of their 1,000-year record of victory was almost as shocking as the gender of the speaker. Warning shot? The destruction of a planet-sized capital ship with 9 billion crew was a warning shot? The arrogance was breathtaking. On the command bridge above, Captain Jatara's voice cut through the comm channel, her tone a mixture of outrage, disbelief, and growing fury. "This is Captain Jatara of the super frigate Retribution's Edge. Identify yourself properly, drone. What female commands your fleet? What warrior speaks for humanity? Surely you are not claiming to hold rank yourself?" The question hung in the void for a moment, and Doroni found herself holding her breath. Surely this was some elaborate insult, some psychological warfare designed to unsettle them before the real commander revealed herself. No species could be so fundamentally broken as to allow males to hold positions of authority. A sound came across the channel that took Doroni a moment to recognize. Laughter. Male laughter, rich with genuine amusement and not a trace of the deference that males should show to their betters. "I'm afraid you misunderstand, Captain," the human replied, his voice carrying an undertone of what might have been pity. "I'm Grand Admiral Charles, Supreme Commander of all human military forces in this sector. There is no female above me in the chain of command. I speak for humanity because humanity has chosen me to do so based on my tactical acumen and leadership capabilities, not my gender." The words hit the Forshim fleet like a physical blow. Doroni felt her claws involuntarily extend, scoring deep grooves in her console. Around her, the weapons bay erupted in sounds of outrage. Hisses, growls, and the distinctive chittering that her species made when confronted with something fundamentally wrong with the natural order. The reaction across the Forshim fleet was immediate and explosive. On every ship, in every weapons bay and command center, female warriors erupted in fury. The very concept was an abomination that violated everything they understood about the universe. Males giving orders, males claiming authority, males pretending to be more than the disposable breeding stock that nature intended. It was like hearing that prey animals had decided to hunt their predators. "Impossible!" Fleet Admiral Rathart's voice roared across the fleet communications, her usual cold composure shattered by sheer disbelief. "Males cannot command, males cannot fight, males cannot lead. What perversion is this? What disease has infected your species?" "Nevertheless," the human admiral replied with maddening calm, his voice steady despite the obvious fury of 14 septillion alien warriors focused on him. "Here I am. And here you are, having just lost your first capital ship in 1,000 years to forces under my command. I find that rather settles the question of capability, don't you? Doroni felt her lips pull back in a snarl, baring her fangs as a red haze of fury clouded her vision. The absolute audacity of this drone, daring to speak to true warriors as an equal, was beyond comprehension. Around her, she could hear the other crew members hissing and chittering in outrage, their voices rising to a crescendo of species-wide indignation. "I'm offering you one chance to surrender," the male voice continued, each word a calculated insult to everything the Forshim held sacred. "Withdraw your forces from this system and return to whatever distant galaxy spawned you. Do this, and I will allow your retreat with honor intact. Refuse, and I will demonstrate why humans have survived and thrived despite being outnumbered by more hostile species than you can count." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of claws scraping against metal as thousands of Forshim warriors struggled to contain their rage. Then Fleet Admiral Rathart's voice cut through the comm channels like a plasma blade, shaking with a fury that transcended mere military anger and reached into the realm of religious outrage. "You dare threaten the daughters of the First Mother? You, a male, dare demand the surrender of the greatest fleet in galactic history?" Her voice rose to a shriek that carried across every ship in the Armada. "We have conquered 14 galaxies. We have subjugated species beyond counting, and you think we will bow to some diseased drone pretending to be a warrior?" A pause, then her voice dropped to a deadly whisper that somehow carried more menace than her screaming. "All vessels, battle formations, close to optimal firing range. We will not be mocked by some perverted male claiming dominion over females. For the First Mother, show these abominations the price of defying the natural order." "For the First Mother," came the responding roar from across the Armada, but now it carried a different edge, not just religious fervor, but personal outrage at having their very nature as the dominant gender challenged by something they considered less than livestock. The battle cry echoed through the void, distorted by millions of voices all screaming in unison. Doroni's targeting systems hummed to full power as her fury crystallized into deadly focus. Her forearms moved across her controls with lethal precision, bringing weapons online that could reduce worlds to ash. Bad enough that these humans had destroyed a capital ship through some impossible technology. But to learn that the order had come from a male, a creature whose only purpose should be to breed and die, was an insult that demanded blood sacrifice on an unprecedented scale. The fleet pressed forward with renewed violence, no longer simply advancing to claim victory, but racing toward a reckoning that would restore the natural order of the universe. Every warrior in the Armada now fought not just for conquest, but for the fundamental principle that males existed to serve, not to command. The very fabric of reality seemed to demand correction. The effect of the human admiral's words was immediate and catastrophic to Forshim discipline. Across the massive Armada, individual ship commanders began accelerating beyond fleet formation parameters, their rage overriding millennia of tactical doctrine. "All vessels, maintain formation." Fleet Admiral Rathart's voice cracked across the communications network, but her own fury undermined her authority. Even as she gave the order, her flagship Eternal Dominion was already surging ahead of the battle line, its massive engines flaring with the brilliant white fire of zero-point energy. Doroni felt the deck plates vibrate beneath her feet, as Captain Jatara made the same choice. The Retribution's edge leaped forward like a predator scenting blood, its sublight engines roaring to maximum thrust. Around them, the carefully orchestrated advance dissolved into a mad rush, as hundreds of thousands of ships abandoned formation discipline in favor of raw speed. "Captain!" Doroni called out, her voice barely audible over the growing engine noise. "We're still outside optimal weapons range. The targeting computers show—" "Fire anyway!" Captain Jatara's voice echoed from the bridge, thick with species-wide outrage. Full spread. Show these perverts what happens when drones forget their place. Doroni's training warred with her fury for exactly half a second before rage won. Her claws stabbed at the firing controls with vicious satisfaction, sending commands racing through the ship's weapons grid. Plasma cannons that were designed for precise, devastating strikes at close range began charging for maximum distance shots that would dissipate uselessly across the void. Around the Retribution's edge, the same scene played out on thousands of other vessels. Particle beam arrays meant for surgical strikes began cycling up for long-range bombardment. Molecular disruptors that required precise targeting to tear apart matter at the quantum level started firing wild bursts toward the distant human formations. The effect was spectacular and completely ineffective. Streams of coherent energy lanced across the Georgia Nestra system, turning the void between the fleets into a light show of unprecedented scale. Plasma bolts that could vaporize mountains dissipated harmlessly in the vacuum, their energy bleeding away across millions of canarths. Particle beams that could core asteroids spread into diffuse clouds of charged particles that barely registered on enemy sensors. The weapon's effectiveness at 7% and falling, Doroni reported through gritted teeth, watching her targeting displays show miss after miss. Range is still too extreme for proper target lock. I don't care, Captain Jatara snarled back. Keep firing. The sight of our fury alone should make them flee. But the humans weren't fleeing. Through the chaos of weapons fire and engine flares, Doroni could see them maintaining their defensive positions around the fourth planet with infuriating calm. Their formations remained tight and disciplined while the greatest fleet in galactic history charged at them like an enraged mob. The irony was lost on none of the Forshim warriors, but their rage was too complete for tactical thinking. 9 billion crew members had died on the Mother's wrath. 9 billion daughters of the First Mother, warriors who had trained their entire lives for galactic conquest, and they had died at the command of a male. A drone, a creature whose species should have known better than to let it leave the breeding pens. Distance to effective weapons range? Captain Jatara demanded. 14 minutes at current acceleration, Doroni replied, her voice tight with frustration. But Captain, we're burning through our energy reserves with these long-range shots. If we maintain this firing pattern, the First Mother will provide. Jatara cut her off. No male will claim victory over her daughters. Continue firing. The Forshim fleet thundered across the system like an avalanche of metal and fury, their weapons creating a wall of energy that should have intimidated any rational enemy into immediate surrender. Instead, the humans continued to wait with the patience of apex predators, their formations as steady as if they were conducting a training exercise rather than facing the most powerful military force in known space. Doroni's ears flattened against her skull as a terrible thought crept into her mind. What if the humans weren't intimidated because they had more surprise waiting? What if this Grand Admiral Charles, this impossible male commander, actually knew what he was doing? She pushed the thought away with a snarl and kept firing into the void, adding her ship's fury to the greatest display of military might the galaxy had ever seen. Male or not, the humans would learn that some insults could only be answered with extinction. Captain, weapon systems approaching critical temperature thresholds, Doroni called out, her voice cutting through the cacophony of overworked plasma cannons and particle beam arrays. The targeting console beneath her claws was becoming uncomfortably hot, warning runes flashing angry red across every surface. Steam was actually beginning to rise from some of the cooling vents, and the acrid smell of overheated electronics filled the weapons bay. Primary plasma batteries at 87% thermal capacity. Molecular disruptors are cycling at half efficiency. If we continue this barrage, keep firing, Captain Jatara's voice crackled back with undiminished fury, the comm speakers distorting with the intensity of her rage. I don't care if we melt every weapon on this ship. I don't care if we burn out every system we have. No male gives orders to the daughters of the First Mother." Around the weapons bay, warning lights strobed in synchronized chaos as system after system reported dangerous heat levels. The massive plasma conduits that fed the ship's primary batteries were glowing cherry red through their transparent housings, their coolant systems screaming warnings that went unheeded. The molecular disruptors were cycling slower now, their quantum targeting matrices requiring additional cooling cycles between shots that left gaps in their firing pattern. Even the ship's massive heat sinks, engineering marvels designed to handle sustained combat against entire planetary defense networks, were approaching their operational limits with alarming speed. "Thermal warnings across all weapon systems," Weapons Specialist Kanif reported from her station, her voice tight with mounting concern as she watched her displays fill with angry red indicators, primary cooling systems at maximum capacity, secondary heat exchangers showing stress fractures. "We're pushing them beyond safe parameters, Weapons Officer." "Emergency coolant reserves are being automatically deployed," Technical Officer Naranik added, her ears flat against her skull as she monitored the ship's increasingly desperate attempts to manage the heat buildup. "But at this rate of expenditure, we'll exhaust them in 6 minutes." Durrani's ears flicked in acknowledgement, but she kept her claws locked on the firing controls, her knuckles white with strain. The rage burning through her veins was hotter than any overheating weapon system, hotter than the plasma conduits threatening to breach their containment fields. 9 billion warriors dead at the command of a drone. 9 billion daughters of the First Mother whose deaths would be avenged if she had to personally tear apart every human ship with her bare claws. The Retribution's Edge thundered forward with the rest of the fleet, its engines pushed to maximum thrust as it raced toward the human defensive positions. Around them, the cosmic ballet of destruction continued as hundreds of thousands of Forshim vessels poured fire into the void, their combined fury creating a light show visible from neighboring star systems. The outer asteroid belt of the Georgia Nestor system grew larger in the viewports with each passing second. A sparse collection of rocks and ice that had seemed utterly insignificant during their initial sensor sweeps, just another navigational hazard to be avoided during their approach to the human defensive positions, just empty space filled with cosmic debris. They were catastrophically wrong. The alarms began as a single, piercing wail that cut through every other sound on the ship. Then another joined it, then dozens more, until the very air seemed to vibrate with warning klaxons and emergency signals. "Multiple contacts emerging from the asteroid field," the sensor operator's voice screamed across the communication channels, her professional composure shattered by what she was seeing. "Fighter-class vessels, massive formations breaking concealment, stealth fields dissipating across the entire asteroid belt." Durrani's tactical display exploded with new contacts as what had appeared to be empty space suddenly swarmed with hostile craft. The asteroids themselves seemed to be giving birth to clouds of human fighters, their surfaces splitting apart to reveal hidden launch bays and concealed docking platforms. Stealth fields that had perfectly mimicked the electromagnetic signatures of space rocks flickered and died, revealing the truth. The entire outer asteroid belt had been converted into a massive ambush zone. But these weren't the scattered patrols or reconnaissance flights they had expected. This was a coordinated strike force that defied every assumption about human military capabilities. "First Mother preserve us," Durrani whispered, watching the numbers cascade across her screen in an endless waterfall of hostile contacts. 1.2 billion human fighters burst from concealment like angry insects from a disturbed hive, their crude fusion drives painting bright blue-white trails against the now revealed artificial structures hidden among the asteroids. 744 million of the larger bomber craft accompanied them, their angular hulls bristling with weapon pods and what appeared to be massive torpedo tubes that could threaten even capital ships. The fighters were sleek, predatory things, smaller than Forshim equivalents, but moving with a vicious agility that spoke of advanced maneuvering systems and pilot skill. The bombers were massive by comparison, flying fortresses that seemed designed for one purpose, killing ships much larger than themselves. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. "Weapons officer," Technical Officer Naranak called out, her voice cracking with disbelief as she processed the tactical data flooding her station. "Each manned craft is accompanied by multiple unmanned units. They're flying in tight formation patterns, exactly 26 drones per piloted vessel, perfect coordination across the entire force." The mathematics hit Duroni like a physical blow to the stomach. If each human pilot controlled 26 additional craft, that meant they were facing not the 2 billion craft they could see, but over 50 billion individual combat platforms. The swarm emerging from the asteroid field was larger than most Forshim sector fleets, larger than the defensive forces of entire star systems. "Impossible," she breathed, watching her tactical display struggle to track the sheer number of contacts. Red icons filled the holographic projection until it looked like a solid wall of hostiles. "No species has that many pilots. No one builds fleets of that size for individual star systems. The resource expenditure alone would bankrupt most galactic civilizations." But the evidence was right there on her sensors. A tide of human craft washing toward the Forshim fleet like a technological tsunami. The fighters darted between the larger bombers with predatory grace, their formations flowing like living things as they adjusted their approach vectors. The unmanned wingmen moved in perfect synchronization with their human controllers, their coordination so flawless they seemed to share a single mind. "Oh, fighter wings, launch immediately!" Fleet Admiral Rathart's voice roared across the fleet communications, her usual composed demeanor shattered by the magnitude of the threat bearing down on them. "Combat Air Patrol, maximum deployment. All carriers, emergency launch protocols, defend the capital ships." But the Forshim weren't ready. Their fighters were still secured in their hangars, weapons systems powered down for routine maintenance, pilots scattered throughout the massive ships attending to a dozen different duties. The fleet had been configured for a long-range bombardment followed by a methodical advance, standard doctrine that had served them well across 14 galaxies of conquest. No one had expected the humans to strike first, and certainly not with forces hidden so close to their own formation. "Estimated time to fighter launch?" Captain Jatara demanded, her voice tight with growing panic. "Minimum 4 minutes for first-wave deployment," came the strained reply from the Flight Operations Center. "Full combat air patrol will require 12 minutes. Pilots are scrambling, but launch bay pressurization takes time." "We don't have 12 minutes," Duroni snarled, watching the human swarm close the distance with terrifying speed. The lead elements were already within the outer engagement envelope, and her weapon systems were still cycling through heat management protocols. "Primary weapons are operating at reduced efficiency. Close-range targeting systems weren't designed for threats at this distance and speed." It was the nightmare scenario that Forshim tactical doctrine had always assumed was impossible. For 1,000 years, their enemies had died at long range, picked apart by precise fire from capital ship weapons systems, designed for methodical destruction at comfortable distances. Their guns were built for dueling with other capital ships, not swatting clouds of small, fast-moving targets that could slip between their firing arcs. No enemy had ever gotten close enough to threaten the fleet with small craft attacks. No enemy had ever been fast enough, clever enough, or desperate enough to try. The human fighters entered effective weapons range and opened fire as one. The effect was like watching a star go supernova in slow motion. 50 billion individual weapon systems discharged simultaneously, turning the space between the fleets into a hellscape of energy beams, projectile streams, and missile contrails. The fighters carried weapons that seemed primitive by Forshim standards: kinetic railguns, chemical explosives, fusion warheads, but they carried them in vast quantities and used them with surgical precision. The first explosions bloomed along the Forshim line like deadly flowers. A destroyer, the Swift Retribution, vanished in a ball of nuclear fire as a concentrated missile barrage overwhelmed its point defenses. The expanding plasma cloud illuminated nearby ships in stark relief before dissipating into the void. A frigate tried to turn away from the oncoming swarm and took a railgun slug through its reactor section, the impact sending it tumbling end over end as secondary explosions tore through its hull. "Incoming ordnance!" the sensor operator screamed, her voice barely audible over the chaos erupting around them. "Multiple torpedo spreads targeting capital ships. Point defense systems engaging." The bombers had begun their attack runs, their massive torpedo tubes cycling with mechanical precision as they sought out the largest targets in the Forshim formation. Each bomber carried ordnance designed specifically for capital ship killing, weapons that could crack the armor of a planet-sized vessel if delivered with sufficient accuracy. But the point defense systems designed to handle conventional attacks from conventional enemies found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming threats. Laser grids that could intercept hundreds of missiles per minute were faced with thousands. Particle beam networks optimized for long-range engagement couldn't track targets moving at such close range and high speed. The Eternal Justice, a capital ship carrying 12 billion crew members, staggered as a full torpedo spread detonated against its forward shields. The energy barriers held, but barely, their protective glow flickering dangerously as they absorbed energies equivalent to stellar output. "Direct hit on the Glorious Conquest," came a panicked transmission. "Multiple hull breaches, requesting immediate assistance." The Glorious Conquest, the capital ship that had participated in the subjugation of 3 entire galaxies, was trailing atmosphere and debris as human bombers swarmed around it like predators around wounded prey. Its point defense grid flickered and died as bomber-launched torpedoes found their marks, each explosion sending shock waves through the massive hull. Durrani watched in horrified fascination as a group of human fighters, no larger than atmospheric aircraft, conducted a strafing run on a ship the size of a small moon. Their weapons couldn't possibly penetrate the capital ship's armor, but they weren't aiming for the armor. They were targeting sensor arrays, communication dishes, point defense emplacements, systematically blinding and deafening their massive opponent. "Weapon systems overheating," Weapons Specialist Caniff called out, her station now wreathed in steam and warning lights. "Primary plasma conduit showing stress fractures. We need to reduce firing rate or risk catastrophic failure." "Never." Captain Jatara's voice came back, distorted by rage and desperation. "Keep firing. Keep—" The Retribution's edge shuddered as something massive struck their shields. Through the viewport, Durrani could see human fighters streaking past, their formation patterns so tight they seemed to be flying through the spaces between atoms. Behind them came the bombers, their torpedo tubes cycling for another salvo. An explosion lit up the port side of the ship as a human torpedo found its mark on a nearby cruiser. The determined fury broke apart like a snapped twig, its hull section spinning away in different directions as its reactor went critical. The blast was close enough to rattle the Retribution's edge, close enough for Durrani to see individual Forshim warriors being swept into space by decompression. "Emergency power to shields," Captain Jatara screamed. "All weapons continuous fire, kill them all." But their weapons were designed for long-range precision, not close-quarters combat. The human craft were already inside the optimal engagement envelope, too close for the massive capital ship weapons to track effectively. It was like trying to swat flies with a siege cannon, theoretically possible but practically futile. Another capital ship, the Mother's Vengeance, disappeared in a cascade of explosions as concentrated fire from an entire bomber wing overwhelmed its defenses. 9 billion more daughters of the First Mother, gone in an instant. The universe had suddenly become a very dangerous place for the Forshim fleet, and their enemy was just getting started. The space around the Forshim fleet had become a 3-dimensional killing field, filled with the deadly ballet of 50 billion human craft weaving between capital ships the size of planets. Durrani watched her tactical display with a mixture of professional admiration and species-deep horror, as the human formations flowed around Forshim vessels like water around rocks, their movements coordinated with a precision that defied belief. "Target lock on human bomber formation," she called out, her overheated targeting systems finally managing to acquire a group of the larger craft. "Firing!" A stream of superheated plasma lanced out from the Retribution's edge, its coherent energy bright enough to briefly outshine the system's red dwarf. The beam sliced through space toward the human bombers with devastating accuracy and struck nothing but void as the enemy craft scattered like startled birds, their reaction time impossibly fast. "Miss," Dakota snarled, her claws scoring deep grooves in her console. "How are they moving that quickly?" The answer came as she watched the tactical replay. The human pilots weren't just reacting to the plasma beam, they were anticipating it, their formations breaking apart milliseconds before the weapon even fired. Their sensor networks and tactical computers were somehow predicting Forshim targeting solutions and responding accordingly. "Got one!" Weapons Specialist Knief called out triumphantly as her particle beam array managed to catch a human fighter that had strayed too far from its formation. The small craft simply vaporized under the massive energy discharge, its destruction marked by a brief flash of expanding plasma. But even as the fighter died, its 26 unmanned wingmen continued their attack run, their formation closing seamlessly to compensate for the loss. The drones showed no hesitation, no fear. They simply adjusted their flight paths and pressed forward with mechanical determination. "Another hit," Technical Officer Naranik reported, as a molecular disruptor found its mark on a human bomber. The angular craft came apart at the quantum level, its matter dispersing into component atoms. "Weapons are starting to connect, but the targeting solutions are difficult at this range." Around them, other Forshim vessels were finally beginning to score hits against the human swarm. A destroyer's plasma grid caught 3 fighters in a crossfire, reducing them to expanding clouds of superheated gas. A frigate's particle beam array swept through a bomber formation, its coherent energy turning 2 of the massive craft into brief stars before they dissipated. But for every human craft destroyed, 20 more pressed home their attacks. The bombers had divided into hunting packs, each group targeting a specific capital ship with single-minded determination. They showed no concern for their own survival. Their only goal was clearly to inflict maximum damage on the largest Forshim vessels before they were inevitably destroyed. The Divine Retribution, a capital ship carrying 14 billion crew members, staggered under a coordinated assault from over 1,000 bombers. Torpedo after torpedo slammed into its shields, each impact sending cascading energy discharges across the massive vessel's defensive barriers. The shields flickered, failed in several sections, then reformed as backup generators came online. "The humans are focusing exclusively on capital ships," Dakota observed, watching the tactical patterns develop across her display. "They're ignoring our escorts entirely, unless they're blocking access to the larger targets." It was a tactically sound decision that spoke to human desperation and cunning in equal measure. The bombers couldn't possibly destroy every ship in the Forshim fleet. There were simply too many targets and too few attackers. But they could potentially cripple or destroy enough capital ships to deal a psychological blow that would reverberate across the galaxy. "Incoming!" the sensor operator screamed as a formation of human fighters dove toward the Retribution's edge itself. The fighters came in low and fast, their railguns spitting streams of hypervelocity projectiles at the superfrigate's sensor arrays and communication dishes. The rounds sparked off the ship's armor without penetrating, but they didn't need to. They were systematically destroying the Retribution's edge's ability to see and communicate with the rest of the fleet. Dakota swung her targeting systems toward the attacking fighters, her overheated plasma cannons cycling to full power despite their dangerous temperature levels. Firing on attacking craft, the plasma stream lanced out just as the human formation broke apart, their movements so perfectly coordinated it seemed choreographed. But this time, something unexpected happened. 3 of the unmanned drones deliberately threw themselves into the path of the energy beam, their hulls vaporizing instantly as they absorbed the shot meant for their human controller. "They're using the drones as shields," Kenneth called out in amazement. The unmanned craft are deliberately intercepting our fire. It was a tactic no Forshim commander would have considered, sacrificing valuable military assets to protect individual pilots. But the humans seemed to value their organic warriors above their machines, willing to expend dozens of drones to keep a single pilot alive and fighting. The surviving human fighter completed its attack run, its railgun rounds finding their marks on 2 more sensor arrays before it streaked away to rejoin the swarm. Behind it, 3 expanding clouds of debris marked where its robotic wingman had died in its place. "Multiple capital ship distress signals," came a panicked voice over the fleet communications. "The Immortal Glory is reporting critical damage to main reactor systems. The Endless Conquest has lost primary shield generators. The Mother's Wrath Avenged is venting atmosphere from 17 hull breaches." Across the Forshim line, planet-sized vessels that had never known defeat were being systematically mauled by craft smaller than their own maintenance shuttles. The humans showed no fear, no hesitation. They pressed their attacks with the desperate fury of a species fighting for its very survival. Then, finally, salvation began to arrive. "First fighter squadrons launching from Carrier Group 7, came a triumphant voice over the communications network. "Combat air patrol deploying." Through the chaos of the battle, Durrani could see the massive carrier ships finally beginning to disgorge their own fighter craft. Sleek Forshim interceptors burst from launch bays hundreds of canarths wide, their pilots eager to restore honor to their species after the shocking initial assault. Each fighter was larger and more heavily armed than its human equivalent, crewed by warriors who had trained their entire lives for space combat. "About time," Captain Jitara's voice crackled over the comm, her relief evident despite her continued fury. "Vector them toward the human bomber formations. Show these drones what real pilots can do." The first squadrons of Forshim fighters streaked toward the human formations with predatory grace, their plasma cannons charging and missile racks cycling to full readiness. Behind them, more squadrons continued launching from carriers across the fleet. Hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of interceptors racing to join the battle. But the human bombers had already done tremendous damage. 3 capital ships were listing badly, their massive hulls scarred by torpedo impacts and their shield generators failing. Dozens of smaller vessels had been destroyed outright, their wreckage adding to the chaos of the battlefield. "Enemy fighters approaching from bearing 270, the sensor operator called out. "Forshim interceptors moving to engage." The real battle was about to begin. The space around the Forshim fleet had become a maelstrom of destruction that defied comprehension. What had begun as a coordinated human ambush was evolving into something far more terrifying. A systematic dismantling of the most powerful military force in galactic history by opponents who should have been nothing more than an annoyance. "Direct hit on the Eternal Vengeance," came a strained voice over the fleet communications. "Reactor containment failing. All hands abandon ship." Durrani watched in horrified fascination as the massive capital ship, a vessel that had overseen the conquest of 2 entire star systems, began to tear itself apart from within. The human bombers had somehow managed to penetrate its defensive screens long enough to deliver a concentrated torpedo spread directly into its power core. The resulting explosion sent shockwaves through the quantum foam of space itself. The capital ship's death throes visible as cascading energy discharges that lit up half the battlefield. That made 17 capital ships destroyed in the last 10 minutes alone. "The divine retribution is breaking apart," another panic transmission crackled through the chaos. "Hull integrity compromised. We're losing life support on decks 400 through 600. Through her tactical display, Durrani could see the planet-sized vessel's death agony playing out in real time. Human bomber squadrons swarmed around it like antibodies attacking an infection, their torpedo tubes cycling with mechanical precision as they delivered salvo after salvo into the massive ship's wounded sections. Each impact sent chunks of hull plating spinning into the void, some pieces large enough to qualify as asteroids in their own right. The divine retribution listed to port as its structural integrity finally gave way, the ship's forward section separating from the main hull in a cascade of secondary explosions. 14 billion Forshim warriors, gone in an instant, their deaths marked only by the expanding cloud of debris that had once been their home. 23 capital ships destroyed and counting, Weapons Specialist Kniff reported, her voice tight with disbelief as she monitored the tactical feeds. The humans are maintaining their focus on the largest targets. They're not even engaging our escorts unless they have to. It was a strategy born of desperation and executed with ruthless efficiency. The human bombers couldn't possibly destroy the entire Forshim fleet. There were simply too many ships and too few attackers. But they could potentially eliminate enough capital ships to deal a psychological blow that would echo across the galaxy for generations. Carrier Group 12 reporting critical damage, came another transmission. Launch bays compromised. We've lost the ability to deploy fighters. Durrani's tactical display updated with yet another loss. The Proud Mother, a carrier that had launched fighter squadrons in over 200 separate engagements across 14 galaxies. Human bombers had somehow managed to target its massive hangar bays with surgical precision, their torpedoes penetrating deep into the ship's interior before detonating. The resulting explosions had turned the carrier's launch facilities into twisted wreckage, trapping thousands of fighters that would never see combat. "That's our 47th carrier lost," Technical Officer Naranak reported grimly. "The humans are prioritizing our ability to launch fighters almost as much as they're targeting capital ships." The tactical logic was sound, if terrifying in its implications. By destroying carriers, the humans were preventing the Forshim from deploying their own fighter screens, ensuring that the bomber formations could continue their work with minimal interference from properly equipped interceptors. "Multiple destroyer formations reporting destruction," came another voice over the increasingly chaotic communications network. The Swift Death, Righteous Fury, and Mother's Sword had been eliminated by concentrated fighter attack. The smaller ships were dying too, picked off by human fighters that darted between the capital ship formations like predators hunting in a pack. Each destroyer that fell represented another hole in the fleet's defensive network, another gap through which the bombers could strike at larger targets. "Enemy fighter formation approaching from bearing 047, the sensor operator called out, her voice cracking with stress. "They're heading directly for us." Durrani swung her targeting systems toward the incoming threat, her overheated plasma cannons protesting as they cycled to full power. Through the tactical displays she could see them, a full squadron of human fighters accompanied by their inevitable cloud of unmanned wingmen, all moving with the deadly precision that had already claimed so much Forshim blood. "Incoming strike craft," Captain Jatara's voice echoed from the bridge. "All weapons, engage. Point defense systems, maximum dispersion." The Retribution's edge shuddered as its defensive grid came to life, particle beams and plasma streams lancing out toward the approaching human formation. The fighters scattered like startled birds, their movements so perfectly coordinated they seemed to share a single mind. But this time, the Forshim gunners were ready for their evasion patterns. "Hit!" Kniff called out triumphantly as her particle beam found its mark on one of the unmanned drones. The machine simply ceased to exist, its matter converted to energy in a brilliant flash. But the human pilot pressed on, his remaining wingmen adjusting their formation to compensate for the loss. Railgun rounds sparked off the Retribution's edge's armor as the fighters began their attack run, their projectiles seeking out sensor arrays and communication dishes with practiced precision. "Target the lead fighter," Durrani commanded, her targeting computers finally achieving a solid lock on the human pilot. "Maximum power." Her plasma cannon discharged with enough force to vaporize a small moon, the coherent energy beam lancing through space toward its target. But even as the shot connected, something went wrong. The human fighter, already damaged by debris from an earlier engagement, didn't simply vaporize under the plasma impact. Instead, its pilot seemed to deliberately steer into the beam, using his craft's destruction as a kinetic weapon. The fighter's wreckage, still traveling at tremendous velocity and now wreathed in superheated plasma, continued on its original trajectory, straight toward the Retribution's Edge's secondary bridge complex. "Incoming debris!" someone screamed. "Collision imminent!" The burning remains of the human fighter struck the ship's auxiliary command center with the force of a tactical nuclear weapon. The secondary bridge, a massive structure that housed the ship's life support coordination, engineering command centers, and personnel management systems, erupted in a ball of plasma fire that could be seen from neighboring vessels. The impact sent shockwaves through the entire ship, throwing Doroni against her console with enough force to crack 2 of her ribs. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power grid fluctuated, and the acrid smell of burning electronics filled the weapons bay. "Secondary bridge destroyed," came a panicked report from damage control. "Life support command center offline. Engineering coordination systems are down. We're losing atmosphere on decks 7 through 15. Alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Not the measured warnings of combat damage, but the urgent klaxons that indicated catastrophic system failures. The Retribution's Edge listed to starboard as its attitude control system struggled to compensate for the massive breach in its superstructure. "Emergency power to life support." Captain Jatera's voice crackled over the communication system, distorted by static and interference. "Seal all compromised sections, damage control teams to the secondary bridge complex." But Doroni knew it was too late. The secondary bridge had been completely destroyed, taking with it the ship's ability to coordinate life support across its massive hull. Thousands of crew members in the affected sections would be fighting for their lives as atmosphere vented into space and emergency systems failed to engage. Around them, the battle continued with undiminished fury. The tactical displays showed the continuing massacre of the Forshim fleet as human bombers pressed home their attacks with suicidal determination. Capital ships were dying at a rate of nearly 1 per minute, their massive hulls torn apart by weapons that shouldn't have been able to penetrate their defenses. "The glorious mother is gone," came another transmission. "Direct torpedo hit on the reactor complex, 14 billion crew lost. Carrier Group 7 has been eliminated," reported another voice. "All 15 carriers destroyed. We've lost our entire fighter deployment capability in that sector." The numbers were becoming overwhelming. In less than 30 minutes of combat, the humans had destroyed over 800 capital ships, vessels that represented the accumulated military might of centuries of conquest. Thousands of smaller ships had been eliminated, their destruction marked only by brief flashes of light against the starfield. Hundreds of carriers had been systematically targeted and destroyed, their fighter squadrons dying in their launch bays before they could even reach combat. "Multiple reactor breaches detected across the fleet," came a particularly dire report. "The infinite conquest, Mother's divine will, and eternal supremacy are all showing critical power failures." Doroni watched through her tactical display as 3 more capital ships began the death spiral that had claimed so many of their sisters. The human bombers had learned to target specific systems, reactor housings, shield generators, life support nexuses, with surgical precision that spoke to detailed intelligence gathering and careful planning. "How are they so accurate?" Knife wondered aloud, her voice barely audible over the continuing alarms. "They're hitting critical systems with almost every torpedo spread." The answer was becoming terrifyingly clear. The humans hadn't just prepared an ambush, they had studied Forshim ship designs in minute detail, identifying every weakness and vulnerability in their construction. The torpedo strikes weren't random. They were precisely calculated to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. "Destroyer squadrons 12 through 18 eliminated," came another report. "Frigate formation 7, 9, and 15 have been wiped out. The humans are systematically destroying our screening forces." "Engineering reports multiple hull breaches," Technical Officer Naranek called out, her station now wreathed in smoke from overloaded circuits. "The secondary bridge explosion has compromised structural integrity in sections 4 through 7. We're venting atmosphere and personnel." The Retribution's edge was dying around them, its massive hull scarred by the human fighter's suicidal attack. But through the chaos and destruction, one thing remained clear. The battle was far from over. On her tactical display, Doroni could see that the Forshim fleet was finally beginning to deploy its own fighters in significant numbers. Thousands of interceptors were streaming from the surviving carriers, their pilots eager to restore honor to their species and exact vengeance for the devastating losses they had suffered. But the humans had already achieved something that no enemy in Forshim history had ever accomplished. They had proven that the daughters of the First Mother could bleed, could die, and could be defeated by opponents they had dismissed as inferior. The psychological damage might prove even more devastating than the physical losses. The vacuum between the fleets erupted into the largest dogfight in galactic history as tens of thousands of Forshim interceptors engaged the human fighter screens. Sleek and predatory, each Forshim fighter was twice the size of its human equivalent and armed with plasma cannons that could punch through capital ship armor. Their pilots were veterans of 100 campaigns, warriors who had spent decades perfecting the art of space combat. They should have swept the human fighters from the void like chaff before the wind. First contact with human fighters came an excited transmission from Squadron Leader Kimchar aboard the interceptor Mother's Claw. Engaging now for the honor of the... Her transmission cut off abruptly as her fighter exploded in a ball of superheated plasma, destroyed by a perfectly placed railgun burst from a human pilot who had anticipated her attack vector with impossible precision. "Kimchar is down," came a panicked voice from her wingman. "How did they? The humans saw her coming before she even fired." Across the battlefield, the same scenario was playing out hundreds of times simultaneously. Forshim pilots who had never known defeat found themselves outmaneuvered, outthought, and outfought by opponents flying inferior craft with primitive weapons. The humans moved with a fluidity and precision that seemed to transcend normal piloting skills, anticipating Forshim tactics before they were even implemented. "Squadron 7 reporting heavy losses," came another transmission. "The humans are using coordinated attacks. They're not fighting like individuals. They're fighting like they share the same mind." Doroni monitored the fighter engagement through her tactical display, her weapons systems finally cool enough to engage capital targets again. What she saw defied every assumption about human military capabilities. The enemy fighters weren't just good, they were operating at a level of tactical sophistication that shouldn't have been possible. "Target human bomber formation bearing 270, she commanded, her plasma cannon cycling to full charge. "Maximum power dispersal." But even as she spoke, she was watching a human fighter pilot execute a maneuver that pushed the very limits of physics. The small craft pulled a brutal 15G turn that should have incapacitated its pilot, then rolled inverted and fired a missile barrage while flying backwards at incredible velocity. The Forshim interceptor pursuing it was destroyed before its pilot even realized what had happened. "How are they surviving those acceleration forces?" Weapons Specialist Kniff wondered aloud, her own targeting systems tracking the seemingly impossible human maneuver. Those G-forces should be fatal to any organic creature. The human pilots seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to withstand punishment that would kill most species. Their fighters danced through space with a grace that spoke of enhanced reflexes, superior training, or perhaps some form of technological augmentation that the Forshim intelligence services had never detected. "Squadron 12 engaging human bomber formation," came a voice over the communications. "We have them outnumbered 3-1. But the human response was immediate and devastating. As the Forshim interceptors closed on the bombers, the escorting fighters and their drone wingmen did something completely unexpected. They formed a defensive shell around the larger craft and began firing in all directions simultaneously, creating an impenetrable wall of defensive fire. The Forshim pilots found themselves flying into a maelstrom of projectiles and energy beams, their attack runs disrupted by defensive patterns that seemed to anticipate their every move. The human drones weren't trying to achieve individual kills. They were creating enough chaos and confusion to prevent the interceptors from reaching the bombers. "They're not fighting to win dogfights," Squadron Leader Dorvin called out in frustration. "They're fighting to delay us. Every second we spend on the fighters is another second the bombers have to target our capital ships." It was tactically brilliant in its ruthless simplicity. The human fighter screens didn't need to destroy every Forshim interceptor. They just needed to keep them busy long enough for the bombers to complete their mission. And the bombers were completing their mission with devastating efficiency. "The divine retribution is breaking apart," came another transmission as one of the fleet's super-heavy capital ships succumbed to concentrated torpedo fire. "Hull integrity has failed. We're losing all hands." Through the tactical display, Doroni could see the massive vessel's death throes as its quantum-reinforced hull finally gave way under the sustained bombardment. The ship split along its primary axis, its two halves spinning away from each other in a shower of debris and escaping atmosphere. 22 billion crew members gone in an instant. "That brings us to over 1,000 capital ships lost." Captain Jitara's voice crackled over the intercom, her tone hollow with disbelief. 1,000 in less than an hour of combat. The numbers were staggering. Each capital ship represented centuries of construction, trillions of credits in resources, and crews that numbered in the tens of billions. The humans were systematically dismantling military assets that had taken the Forshim Empire millennia to accumulate. "Multiple carrier groups reporting destruction," came another panicked transmission. "Groups 9, 15, and 23 have been eliminated. We're losing our ability to deploy fighters faster than we can launch them." The human bombers had identified the critical weakness in Forshim fleet doctrine, their dependence on carrier-based fighter support. By systematically destroying the massive carrier ships, they were preventing the Forshim from deploying their numerical advantage in small craft. Each carrier that died took with it not just its own crew, but hundreds of fighters that would never see combat. Despite the overwhelming losses, the Forshim Fighter Corps was beginning to make its numerical superiority felt. For every human fighter destroyed, 3 more Forshim interceptors joined the engagement. The humans were taking casualties now, real losses that their limited numbers couldn't sustain indefinitely. "Confirmed kill on human bomber," came a triumphant transmission from Squadron Leader Mortat. "Direct plasma hit to the reactor section, target destroyed." More victories followed as Forshim pilots began to adapt to human tactics. The enemy fighters might be superior individually, but they were vastly outnumbered. Wave after wave of interceptors threw themselves at the human formations, accepting heavy losses in exchange for whittling down the irreplaceable enemy pilots. "Human fighter formation incoming," the sensor operator called out. "They're targeting our weapons systems." A squadron of human fighters dove toward the Retribution's edge, their movements flowing like a choreographed dance as they adjusted their attack vectors in perfect synchronization. Doroni swung her targeting systems toward them, but the fighters seemed to predict her actions through some form of tactical brilliance she couldn't comprehend. Her plasma stream lanced through empty space as the fighters scattered with inhuman precision, then reformed instantly to continue their attack run. Their railgun rounds sparked off the ship's armor as they systematically targeted every sensor array and weapon mount they could reach. "Point defense systems engaging," Kniff called out, her automated gun systems spraying particle beams in all directions. 2 of the human fighters simply ceased to exist, caught in the crossfire of overlapping defensive grids. But the remaining craft immediately adjusted their approach patterns, learning from their comrades' destruction with the adaptability that seemed to characterize the entire human military. The human pilots were paying a price for their aggression, but they were extracting an even higher cost from their enemies. Each human fighter that died had typically destroyed 2 or 3 Forshim interceptors before succumbing to overwhelming numbers. "Direct hit on the eternal glory," came another transmission. "Reactor cascade failure imminent. All nearby vessels clear the area immediately." The super heavy capital ship, one of the largest vessels in the fleet, began to glow from within as its containment systems failed. human bombers had somehow managed to penetrate its heavily shielded reactor core, triggering a chain reaction that would consume the entire vessel. The eternal glory detonated with the force of a small star, its death illuminating the entire battlefield in stark relief. The explosion was visible from neighboring star systems, a funeral pyre for 30 billion crew members that had been reduced to their component atoms in a fraction of a second. "We're losing ships faster than we've ever lost them in our entire history." Captain Jatara's voice came over the intercom, her usual composure strained under the weight of unprecedented losses. "These humans fight like they have nothing left to lose," and perhaps that was exactly the case. The human fighters pressed their attacks with a desperation that spoke of a species facing extinction, willing to sacrifice everything for even the slimmest chance of victory. The question was whether the Forshim numerical advantage could overwhelm them before the entire fleet was reduced to expanding clouds of debris. The tide of battle shifted with shocking suddenness, as every human bomber formation across the vast battlefield executed simultaneous withdrawal maneuvers. Like a choreographed dance of destruction reversing itself, the angular craft that had been systematically dismantling the Forshim fleet began pulling back from their targets, their escort fighters forming protective screens around them as they retreated toward the asteroid belt. "Enemy bombers are withdrawing," came a confused transmission from one of the Forshim squadron leaders. All formations pulling back to defensive positions. Turani watched her tactical display with growing bewilderment as the human formations disengaged with the same precision they had shown during their devastating attack. The fighters formed layered defensive screens, their drone wingmen weaving intricate patterns that kept pursuing Forshim interceptors at bay, while the larger bombers accelerated toward the safety of the asteroid field. "Are they retreating?" Weapons Specialist Kanif asked, her voice carrying a note of desperate hope. "Have we finally broken their assault?" But something about the withdrawal felt wrong to Duroni. The human fighters weren't fleeing in panic or disorder. They were conducting a tactical withdrawal with the same cold professionalism they had displayed during their attack. Their formations remained tight, their covering fire precise and effective. This wasn't the retreat of a defeated force, this was a planned maneuver. "Pursue them!" Captain Jatara's voice crackled over the intercom, her fury evident despite the static interference caused by the ship's damaged communication systems. "Oh, fighters, press the attack! Don't let them escape! Make them pay for every canarth of space!" Forshim interceptors surged forward, eager to capitalize on what appeared to be the first sign of human weakness. But the retreating fighters made them pay dearly for every advance, their railguns and missile systems creating a wall of defensive fire that claimed interceptor after interceptor. The human pilots showed no signs of panic or desperation. If anything, they seemed even more focused and deadly during their withdrawal than they had been during their initial assault. "Levy resistance from the withdrawing enemy," came a frustrated transmission from Squadron Leader Mortat, his voice tight with mounting casualties. "They're fighting harder now than when they were attacking. We're taking significant losses for minimal territorial gains." The tactical situation was becoming increasingly puzzling. If the humans were truly retreating, why were they expending so much effort and ammunition to cover their withdrawal? Why maintain such perfect formation discipline if they were genuinely beaten? The more Duroni studied the tactical patterns, the more she suspected this wasn't a retreat at all. It was a repositioning maneuver. The human bombers had almost reached the relative safety of the asteroid field when the communications array of the Retribution's Edge crackled to life with an incoming transmission. The same calm, measured voice that had precipitated this entire catastrophe filled the weapons bay with its infuriating composure, cutting through the background noise of battle damage and emergency repairs. "This is Grand Admiral Charles of the Human Defense Fleet, transmitting to the Forshim Invasion Force." Captain Jatara's response was immediate and predictable, her voice crackling with barely contained rage. "Cut that transmission. I don't want to hear another word from that perverted drone. I've had enough of his psychological games." But Duroni found herself hesitating, her claw hovering over the communication controls. Something in the human admiral's tone suggested this wasn't another attempt at psychological warfare. This was a tactical briefing delivered with the clinical precision of a military professional. And given the devastating losses they had already suffered, perhaps it would be wise to understand what their enemy was planning next. "Captain," she called out, her voice cutting through the bridge chatter and the distant sounds of damage control teams working to seal hull breach. "I recommend we listen to what he has to say. We need to understand their tactical intentions if we're going to counter them effectively." The silence that followed suggested Captain Jitara was wrestling with the same calculation, her military training warring with her species' deep revulsion at taking advice from a male. Finally, her voice came back over the intercom, tight with barely controlled fury but tinged with grudging pragmatism. "Fine. Let the drone speak. But the moment he says anything about surrender terms, cut the transmission immediately." Grand Admiral Charles continued as if he had never been interrupted, his voice carrying the same maddening calm that had characterized all his previous communications. The man seemed utterly unaffected by the massive battle raging around his forces, speaking with the casual confidence of someone discussing routine fleet exercises rather than galactic warfare. "I trust you've had sufficient time to evaluate the effectiveness of our initial strike package," he said, his tone carrying a note of what might have been professional courtesy. "The withdrawal you're currently observing is not a retreat in the traditional sense. The implications hit Dorani like a physical blow to the stomach. The devastating attack they had just endured, the systematic destruction of over 1,000 capital ships, hundreds of carriers, and thousands of smaller vessels, had been conducted with the bomber's initial ammunition loads. The humans weren't retreating because they were defeated or demoralized. They were retreating because they had methodically expended their first wave of torpedoes and needed to rearm for the next phase of their assault. Our logistics network has been operating at maximum efficiency for the past 22 months, the Grand Admiral continued, his tone carrying the casual confidence of someone discussing well-rehearsed contingency plans. "We have established 17 separate ammunition caches throughout the asteroid belt, each one capable of fully resupplying our entire bomber force. Complete rearmament and return to combat status can be accomplished in approximately 3 minutes per bomber squadron." In 3 minutes? Dorani felt her blood turn cold as she processed the terrifying efficiency of human military logistics. In less time than it took to conduct a damage assessment on a single capital ship, the enemy bombers would be returning with fresh loads of the devastating weapons that had already crippled the most powerful fleet in galactic history. "Our munitions manufacturing facilities have been producing ordnance at maximum capacity since we first detected your approach to our outer territories," Grand Admiral Charles explained with the clinical detachment of a military strategist outlining supply chain management. "We have stockpiled sufficient weapons for 17 additional strikes of similar magnitude to what you have just experienced." The weapons bay fell silent except for the distant sounds of damage control teams working to repair the destruction caused by the human fighters' suicidal attack on their secondary bridge complex. 17 additional strikes. Dorani tried to process the mathematics and found her mind recoiling from the implications. If the humans could repeat their current level of destruction 17 more times, there would be nothing left of the Forshim fleet but expanding clouds of debris and radiation. "This represents your final opportunity to surrender with honor intact," Grand Admiral Charles continued, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge that suggested the diplomatic phase of the conversation was drawing to a close. "Withdraw your forces from this system immediately, and we will allow you to depart with your remaining vessels and crews intact. Continue this engagement, and you will discover that humans are masters of what we call asymmetric warfare." "Asymmetric warfare?" Technical Officer Naranak whispered, her voice barely audible over the background noise of emergency repairs and the distant rumble of the ship's damaged engines. "What does that mean in practical terms?" Dorani had a terrible suspicion she was about to find out, and that the answer would redefine her understanding of what modern warfare could become. Traditional military doctrine assumes that conflicts are fought between forces of roughly equivalent technological capability and tactical sophistication, the Grand Admiral explained, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a military academy instructor delivering a lecture on strategic theory. Both sides deploy similar weapons systems, follow comparable tactical doctrines, and engage in conventional force-on-force confrontations where superior numbers and technology generally determine the outcome. The human's voice carried a note of what might have been professional pride, or perhaps grim satisfaction, at having an opportunity to demonstrate theoretical concepts in practical application. Asymmetric warfare involves the deliberate use of unconventional tactics, innovative technologies, and creative strategic thinking to exploit enemy weaknesses while systematically avoiding direct confrontation with enemy strengths. Dorothy felt a chill of recognition as the human admiral's words echoed tactical principles she had studied, but never seen implemented on such a massive scale. The humans had identified every vulnerability in Forshim fleet doctrine, their dependence on long-range engagement, their assumption of technological superiority, their reliance on conventional formation fighting, and had systematically developed countermeasures for each one. You possess superior numbers, superior individual ship capabilities, more advanced weapons technology, and far greater overall resources, Grand Admiral Chow acknowledged with what sounded like genuine respect for Forshim military capabilities. Under conventional tactical circumstances, your victory would be inevitable and overwhelming, but you also have critical vulnerabilities that we have spent considerable time studying, analyzing, and preparing to exploit. The admission was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had already demonstrated the validity of his tactical theories. The humans had somehow managed to identify and target every weakness in a military doctrine that had conquered 14 galaxies without suffering a single major defeat. "Multiple contacts emerging from the asteroid field," the sensor operator suddenly called out, her voice cracking with stress as new threats materialized on her tactical display. "The bombers are returning to their ammunition caches. Resupply operations in progress." Dorothy's tactical display updated with dozens of new contacts as the human bomber formations reached their predetermined resupply points within the asteroid belt. What had appeared to be simple mining operations or research stations revealed themselves as sophisticated logistics hubs, their automated systems working with mechanical efficiency to reload the returning bombers with fresh torpedoes and missiles. Estimated time to bomber rearmament completion? Captain Jatara demanded, her voice tight with the knowledge that they had perhaps minutes to prepare for the next devastating assault. "Based on current activity patterns, 2 minutes and 40 seconds until the first bomber squadrons are ready for combat," came the grim reply from the tactical station. "Full force reconstitution in approximately 3 minutes, 15 seconds. But even as the sensor operator delivered her report, her display began registering new contacts that dwarfed the returning bomber formations. From the direction of the human main fleet, ships that had remained in defensive positions around the fourth planet throughout the entire engagement, massive formations of fresh fighters and bombers were launching and accelerating toward the Forshim fleet. "Additional enemy forces launching from the main human fleet," the sensor operator called out, her voice rising to near-panic levels. "Massive formations, fighter and bomber squadrons in numbers that match our initial engagement." The tactical implications struck Dorothy with stunning force. Everything they had endured, the devastating ambush, the systematic destruction of over 1,000 capital ships, the loss of hundreds of carriers and thousands of smaller vessels, had been accomplished by human forces stationed in the asteroid belt. The main human fleet, safely positioned around their home planet, had not yet committed a single ship to the battle. "Estimated enemy strength of the approaching formations," Captain Jatara demanded, her voice carrying a note of growing desperation. "Preliminary scans indicate approximately equal numbers to the forces we just engaged," came the reply. 1.2 billion fighters with full drone accompaniment, 744 million bombers. "Sir, This means the humans have twice the force strength we initially calculated. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of emergency klaxons and the distant rumble of damaged ship systems struggling to maintain basic operations. The humans had revealed only half their strength during the initial assault. The devastating attack that had crippled the most powerful military force in galactic history had been conducted as a proof of concept, a demonstration of capabilities rather than a full-scale assault. This concludes my final offer of honorable surrender, Grand Admiral Charles said, his voice cutting through the growing chaos on the Forshim communication channels with the calm authority of someone who held all the tactical advantages. If you choose to continue this engagement, you will discover that humans have been preparing for this conflict far longer and far more thoroughly than you might imagine. And I assure you, Admiral Rathard, that asymmetric warfare can be a very unpleasant experience for forces unprepared to counter it. The transmission ended, leaving the Forshim fleet to contemplate the approaching swarm of fresh human forces and the terrible realization that they had been fighting with less than half their enemy's actual strength. The real battle, it seemed, was only just beginning. Admiral Rathard's response crackled across the fleet communication channels with the fury of a dying star, her voice carrying the accumulated rage of a species that had never known defeat until this day of reckoning. "You think we would surrender to a pack of diseased males?" she snarled, her words dripping with contempt that transcended mere military antagonism. "You think the daughters of the First Mother would bow before creatures so perverted they dare to speak in the presence of their betters? I would rather see every ship in this fleet reduced to atomic vapor than accept terms from abominations like you." The communication channels fell silent as Admiral Rathard's declaration echoed through thousands of damaged vessels, her words carrying the weight of species-deep conviction that death was preferable to dishonor. But when she spoke again, her voice had taken on the calculating tone of a military strategist who had identified what she believed to be the key weakness in the human tactical doctrine. "All ships, listen carefully," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos of damage reports and casualty assessments. "These human fighters and bombers are not operating independently. They require host ships to provide navigation, command coordination, and resupply capabilities. The human fleet has withdrawn to maximum range precisely because they know that destroying their command vessels will eliminate their ability to coordinate these swarm attacks." Durrani found herself listening with growing unease as Admiral Rathard outlined her tactical analysis. The reasoning sounded logical on the surface, but something about the human withdrawal pattern suggested a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond simple force protection measures. "Furthermore," the Admiral continued, her voice taking on a note of righteous fury that resonated with every Forshim warrior who heard it, "we have been dishonored by a male creature that dares to command forces in battle against the chosen daughters of the First Mother. This perverted abomination must die, and his death will serve as an example to any other males who might consider challenging the natural order of the galaxy." The Admiral's voice rose to a crescendo of martial passion as she delivered her final orders. "All ships, prepare for full assault. We charge directly through their fighter screens toward the human fleet, destroy their command vessels, kill the male that has dared to oppose us, and restore honor to our species for the glory of the First Mother and the sacred duty of her daughters." A roar of approval swept through the communication channels as thousands of ship captains acknowledged their orders with the fervor of warriors embracing a glorious death. It was the same spirit that had driven Forshim expansion across 14 galaxies, the unshakable conviction that victory or death were the only acceptable outcomes for the chosen daughters of their deity. But even as the Forshim fleet began its desperate charge toward the distant human ships, the tactical situation was deteriorating at an exponential rate. The fresh formations launching from the human home fleet had reached the battlefield, and their impact was immediately apparent. "Multiple bomber formations incoming from bearing 09 No," came a panicked transmission from the frigate Mother's Swift Justice. "They're targeting our engine sections. We're losing propulsion." The difference between fighting the advanced human forces and facing their full strength was like the difference between weathering a storm and being caught in a hurricane. Where the initial human assault had been conducted with surgical precision by limited numbers, the arrival of the main force brought overwhelming firepower that saturated the Forshim defensive networks beyond their capacity to respond. "The divine mandate is under concentrated attack," came another transmission. 7 bomber squadrons focusing fire on our primary reactor housing. "We can't stop them all." Doroni watched her tactical display with growing horror as the fresh human formations demonstrated the same lethal efficiency as their predecessors, but with numbers that made effective defense impossible. The human bombers struck in coordinated waves, their targeting priorities clearly established through some form of central coordination that allowed them to focus overwhelming firepower on specific vessels. "Direct hit on Carrier Group 7, came a desperate transmission. "The Blessed Mother, Sacred Womb, and Divine Birth have all taken critical damage. We're losing the ability to launch fighters." The systematic destruction of carrier assets continued as the human bombers maintained their focus on eliminating the Forshim fleet's ability to deploy defensive fighters. Each carrier that died took with it not just its massive crew, but hundreds of interceptors that would never reach combat, and thousands of pilots whose training represented decades of military investment. "Hull breach on the Righteous Fury," came another transmission. "Torpedo impacted the primary command center. We're losing structural integrity." The capital ship, a vessel that had overseen the conquest of an entire star cluster, began to break apart as its quantum-reinforced hull finally succumbed to concentrated human torpedo fire. The sight of such a massive vessel dying sent shockwaves through the surrounding formations, its destruction serving as a grim reminder that no ship was too large or too well defended to fall to human weapons. But the Forshim fleet pressed on with the desperate courage of warriors who had accepted death as preferable to dishonor. Thousands of ships accelerated toward the distant human fleet, their crews prepared to die in glorious battle rather than accept the humiliation of surrender to male creatures. It was as they reached the inner edge of the asteroid belt that Admiral Rathart's tactical calculations proved catastrophically flawed. "Massive thruster activation detected throughout the asteroid field," the sensor operator aboard the Retribution's Edge called out, her voice rising to near panic levels. "The asteroids are moving. Repeat, the asteroids are under powered propulsion." What had appeared to be a natural asteroid field revealed itself as the most sophisticated weapons system in galactic history. Thousands of asteroids, some no larger than fighter craft, others the size of small moons, suddenly began moving under their own power, massive thruster arrays attached to their surfaces, propelling them in carefully calculated trajectories. "This is impossible," Technical Officer Naronak breathed, her instruments detecting thruster signatures from rocks that should have been inert chunks of stone and metal. "They've weaponized an entire asteroid belt." The scale of the engineering project was beyond comprehension. The humans had somehow managed to attach propulsion systems to thousands of asteroids, turning each one into a kinetic weapon capable of devastating any ship it struck. The amount of preparation, the sheer audacity of the concept, spoke to a level of strategic thinking that redefined what was possible in military engineering. "Incoming asteroid bearing 270, came a panicked transmission from the destroyer Swift Death. "Impact in 30 seconds. We can't evade." The asteroid, a chunk of iron and nickel the size of a capital ship's engine section, struck the destroyer with the force of a tactical nuclear weapon. The smaller vessel simply ceased to exist, its matter converted to energy in a brilliant flash that briefly outshone the local star. But that was only the beginning. As the Forshim fleet advanced deeper into the weaponized asteroid field, the true scope of human planning became apparent. The moving asteroids weren't simply aimed at Forshim ships. They were colliding with stationary asteroids in carefully orchestrated patterns, creating expanding clouds of debris that turned entire sections of space into lethal obstacle courses. Multiple collisions detected throughout the asteroid field, the sensor operator reported, her voice cracking with stress. The humans are creating artificial debris fields. They're herding us into killing zones. A massive asteroid, propelled by thrusters that must have taken months to install, slammed into a cluster of smaller rocks, sending thousands of fragments spinning through space at tremendous velocity. The resulting debris cloud expanded like a malevolent flower, its petals made of stone and metal moving fast enough to punch through capital ship armor. "The Mother's vengeance has been struck by debris," came a transmission from the capital ship's damaged control center. "Multiple hull breaches. We're losing atmosphere on decks 200 through 300. More asteroids joined the deadly ballet, their movements choreographed with inhuman precision to create maximum chaos and destruction. Some targeted Forshim ships directly, while others crashed into asteroid clusters to create new debris fields that channeled the fleet into increasingly narrow corridors of space. "They're not just attacking us," weapons specialist Kenneth observed with growing horror. "They're reshaping the entire battlefield to suit their tactical needs." The realization struck Droney with stunning force. The humans weren't simply defending their territory. They were demonstrating a level of strategic preparation that suggested they had been planning this engagement for years. The moving asteroids, the hidden ammunition caches, the perfectly coordinated withdrawal and resupply operations, none of this could have been improvised. The humans had anticipated a Forshim invasion and had prepared accordingly. "Enemy fleet is withdrawing to maximum range," came a report from the long-range sensors. "The human capital ships are maintaining safe distance while their fighters continue the assault." The human fleet was pulling back even further, their massive ships retreating to positions that would keep them safely out of range of Forshim weapons, while their fighters and bombers continued their devastating work. It was the ultimate expression of asymmetric warfare, using mobile strike craft to attack while keeping irreplaceable capital ships safely removed from direct confrontation. "The Divine Glory is breaking apart," came another panic transmission. "Structural failure cascade, all hands, abandon ship." Another capital ship died as human bombers found their mark, their torpedoes penetrating deep into the vessel's core before detonating with enough force to tear the massive hull apart from within. The ship's death throes were visible across half the battlefield, its destruction marked by secondary explosions that consumed entire sections of its superstructure. "Carrier Group 15 reporting total loss," came another transmission. "All 8 carriers destroyed. We've lost our entire fighter deployment capability in this sector." The systematic destruction of carrier assets continued as human bombers maintained their focus on eliminating the Forshim fleet's ability to project fighter power. Each carrier that died reduced the fleet's defensive capabilities, making it easier for subsequent bomber waves to reach their targets. "Admiral!" Captain Jatara's voice crackled over the intercom, her usual composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of unprecedented losses. "We're losing ships faster than we can count them. Our charge isn't breaking through to the human fleet. We're being systematically destroyed by forces we can't even reach." But Admiral Rathart's response when it came carried the same implacable determination that had driven Forshim expansion across the galaxy. "Continue the advance. All ships maintain course. We will reach the human fleet and destroy the male creatures that dare to oppose us, or we will die in the attempt. There is no third option." The Forshim fleet pressed deeper into the weaponized asteroid field, their ships dying by the hundreds as they advanced through the orchestrated chaos of moving rocks and expanding debris clouds. Behind them, the wreckage of thousands of vessels marked their passage, a trail of destruction that testified to the price of challenging humanity's asymmetric warfare doctrine. The charge continued, driven by honor, desperation, and the unshakable conviction that death was preferable to surrender. The Forshim fleet pressed deeper into the weaponized asteroid field, their formation growing more ragged with each passing minute as human weapons claimed ship after ship. The tactical displays aboard the Retribution's Edge painted a grim picture of destruction, red indicators marking the death of vessels that had once seemed invincible, their names scrolling past in an endless litany of loss. "The Sacred Mother's blessing has been destroyed," came another transmission over the increasingly chaotic communication channels. Direct torpedo impact to the primary reactor. The explosion took out 2 escort frigates. Dironi watched another capital ship die in nuclear fire, its destruction sending shockwaves through the surrounding formation as debris and radiation claimed additional vessels. The systematic destruction continued with mechanical precision, each human bomber wave targeting the largest and most critical ships, while their fighter escorts held off desperate Forshim interceptor attacks. "Carrier Group 20th reporting critical damage," came a panicked voice from deep within the fleet formation. "The Divine Nursery is losing structural integrity. We're evacuating all remaining fighters before hull collapse." The loss of carriers was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the ongoing slaughter. Each massive vessel that died took with it not just its crew of billions, but hundreds of fighters that would never see combat and the infrastructure needed to maintain the fleet's defensive capabilities. The humans had identified the critical weakness in Forshim doctrine and were exploiting it with ruthless efficiency. "Status report on capital ship losses." Captain Jitara's voice crackled over the intercom, her usual composure strained by the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around them. "Preliminary casualty assessment indicates 28% of our capital ships have been destroyed or rendered combat ineffective," came the grim reply from the tactical station. "Carrier losses are approaching 40%. At current attrition rates, we'll lose combat effectiveness within the next 30 minutes. The mathematics of destruction were undeniable. The most powerful military force in galactic history was being systematically dismantled by an enemy that had yet to commit a single capital ship to direct combat. The asymmetric warfare doctrine that Grand Admiral Charles had described was proving devastatingly effective against traditional Forshim military tactics. "Multiple bomber formations targeting the Eternal Empress," came another desperate transmission. "They're focusing fire on Admiral Rathert's flagship. We need immediate fighter support." Dironi felt her blood chill at the implications. If the humans succeeded in destroying the fleet's command ship, the carefully coordinated charge would collapse into chaos as individual captains attempted to continue the advance without central coordination. The Admiral's flagship was the nerve center of the entire operation, and its loss would effectively end any hope of reaching the human fleet. "All available fighters, protect the flagship," Captain Jitara commanded, her voice carrying the desperation of someone who understood that their species' survival might depend on keeping Admiral Rathart alive. "Maximum priority, everything else is secondary." But even as Forshim interceptors rushed to defend their command vessel, the tactical situation continued to deteriorate. The human bomber formations seemed to anticipate every defensive maneuver, their attack patterns adapting in real time to exploit weaknesses in the Forshim fighter screens. "Confirmed kill on human bomber," came a triumphant transmission from Squadron Leader Mortat. "Direct plasma hit to the engine section. Target destroyed." The small victories provided momentary relief, but they were vastly outnumbered by the losses. For every human bomber destroyed, 3 more Forshim interceptors fell to the coordinated defensive fire of drone wingmen and escort fighters. The exchange rate was unsustainable, and everyone knew it. It was as the battered remnants of the Forshim fleet approached the orbit of the system's second planet that a new source of terror materialized on their tactical displays. The world ahead was small and apparently barren, a rocky sphere with no obvious signs of life or military installations. But after everything they had experienced in this system, the very fact that it was a human world made it a source of existential dread. "Planetary approach detected," the sensor operator reported, her voice tight with apprehension. "Range to the second planet decreasing. No obvious surface installations detected, but sensor resolution is limited due to combat damage." The planet loomed before them like a malevolent eye, its cratered surface offering no clues about what horrors the humans might have prepared. After the weaponized asteroid fields and the devastating ambush tactics, every Forshim commander was expecting the worst possible scenario. What are they hiding down there? Technical Officer Naranak whispered, her instruments detecting nothing but standard planetary signatures. "After everything we've seen, that planet has to be armed with something." The collective paranoia of the fleet had reached a critical mass. Every ship captain was imagining planetary defense systems that could dwarf even the asteroid field weapons, hidden installations that could destroy the entire fleet with a single volley. The psychological warfare aspects of the human strategy were proving as effective as their kinetic weapons. "Admiral Rathard is ordering defensive bombardment of the planet," came a transmission from the Fleet Command Center. "All ships with available weapons target the planetary surface. Eliminate whatever installations they're hiding before we get within their range." The order rippled through the fleet with the speed of desperation. Hundreds of capital ships turned their massive plasma cannons toward the innocent-looking world, their crews eager to destroy whatever threat it might represent before it could be used against them. The accumulated firepower of the remaining fleet was enough to crack a planet's crust, and they unleashed it with the fury of warriors who had been pushed beyond their limits. "All weapons, focus fire on the planetary surface," Captain Jitara commanded, her voice carrying the same desperate urgency that had infected the entire fleet. "Maximum power, turn that rock into molten slag." The Retribution's Edge added its firepower to the massive bombardment, its plasma cannons cycling to maximum output as they joined thousands of other weapons in the systematic destruction of a world. The planet's surface erupted in nuclear fire as continent-sized plasma streams carved deep into its crust, turning solid rock into expanding clouds of superheated vapor. "Target the polar regions," came another command. "Don't give them anywhere to hide. Sterilize the entire surface." The bombardment continued for precious minutes as the fleet expended enormous amounts of ammunition and energy on destroying a world that showed no signs of fighting back. Massive craters appeared where plasma streams struck, their edges glowing white, hot as the planet's surface was systematically vaporized. Doroni watched the destruction through her targeting display, her weapons contributing to the annihilation of an entire world. But something felt wrong about the bombardment. There were no defensive installations firing back, no hidden weapons revealing themselves under the pressure of attack. The planet was dying without offering any resistance whatsoever. "Weapons overheating," Weapons Specialist Caniff called out, her control panel flashing warning indicators as the sustained bombardment pushed their systems beyond safe operating parameters. "Thermal management systems approaching critical levels." The warning was echoed throughout the fleet as ship after ship reported weapons overheating from the sustained bombardment. The plasma cannons that were designed for brief, decisive engagements were being pushed far beyond their intended operating limits. "Continue firing," came Admiral Rathard's voice over the communication channels. "Don't stop until that planet is nothing but an expanding cloud of debris." But the planet was already dying, its surface transformed into a hellscape of molten rock and radioactive vapor. Whatever the humans had been hiding there, if they had been hiding anything at all, was certainly destroyed by now. It was then that Grand Admiral Charles's voice crackled over the communication channels, his tone carrying what sounded suspiciously like genuine amusement. "My compliments on your marksmanship," the human admiral said, his voice cutting through the background noise of overheating weapons and emergency cooling systems. "You've successfully destroyed a completely uninhabited rock with no strategic value whatsoever. I'm sure the local asteroid miners will be devastated by the loss of their least profitable mining site." The implications hit the fleet like a physical blow. They had just expended enormous amounts of ammunition and pushed their weapons to the breaking point, attacking a target that posed no threat whatsoever. The humans had manipulated their paranoia and desperation, turning their own tactical caution against them. There was literally nothing on that planet except some automated mining equipment and a few research stations that we evacuated 18 months ago, Grand Admiral Charles continued, his amusement evident despite the clinical tone of his delivery. "But please, continue wasting your ammunition on empty rocks. It makes our job considerably easier." The communication channels erupted in a cacophony of rage and frustration as ship captains realized they had been manipulated into squandering precious resources on a meaningless target. But the damage was already done. Weapons systems throughout the fleet were overheating, ammunition reserves were depleted, and thermal management systems were struggling to cope with the excess heat. "Weapons temperature critical," Knief called out, her instruments showing dangerous heat buildup in their primary plasma cannons. "If we continue firing at current rates, we'll suffer catastrophic system failures." But the situation was even worse than simple overheating. Karoni studied her weapons status display with growing horror as she realized the full implications of their extended engagement. The plasma cannons weren't just overheating, they were showing signs of barrel degradation from sustained use far beyond their design specifications. "Canif," she called out, her voice tight with a new understanding of their tactical situation. "Run a diagnostic on barrel wear patterns. How much life do we have left in our primary weapons?" The weapons specialist's face went pale as her instruments delivered the grim verdict. "Barrel degradation is approaching 60%, she reported, her voice barely audible over the sound of overworked cooling systems. "At current wear rates, we'll need complete barrel replacement within the next 40 minutes of sustained combat." "And our replacement barrel inventory?" Deroni asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "We carry 2 replacement barrel assemblies for each primary cannon," Canif replied, her voice growing smaller with each word. "Enough for normal combat operations over several months. But this level of sustained engagement will exhaust our replacement parts long before this battle ends." The tactical implications struck Bredoni with devastating force. The human strategy wasn't just about overwhelming them with superior numbers or more advanced tactics. It was about forcing them into a style of combat that their equipment wasn't designed to sustain. The Forshim military doctrine assumed brief, decisive engagements where technological superiority would quickly overwhelm opposition. They had never planned for extended battles of attrition against an enemy that could match their firepower and exceed their tactical flexibility. "Captain," Deroni called out over the intercom, her voice carrying the weight of a terrible realization. "We need to inform Admiral Rathard immediately. Our weapons systems aren't designed for this type of extended engagement. We're facing imminent equipment failure across the entire fleet." Captain Jatara's response was immediate and predictable. "Transmit your assessment to Fleet Command. If our weapons are failing, the Admiral needs to know before we lose our ability to fight back entirely." The transmission went out across the fleet communication channels, and the response was swift and devastating. Ship after ship reported similar problems: overheating weapons, degraded barrel assemblies, depleted replacement parts, and thermal management systems pushed beyond their design limits. "This is divine justice, reporting critical weapons malfunction," came one transmission. "Primary plasma cannons have suffered complete barrel failure. We're combat ineffective." "Sacred duty confirming weapons degradation," came another. "Barrel replacement in progress, but we only have 1 spare assembly remaining." The reports cascaded through the fleet as ship captains realized the full scope of their predicament. The humans had maneuvered them into a style of combat that systematically degraded their equipment faster than it could be repaired or replaced. It was asymmetric warfare taken to its logical extreme, using the enemy's own strength against them by forcing unsustainable operational tempos. "All ships, this is Admiral Rathard," came the fleet commander's voice over the communication channels, her tone carrying the grim determination of a warrior who refused to accept defeat even in the face of impossible odds. "We have been outmaneuvered by human tactical doctrine, but we are not defeated. All vessels will cease firing immediately and redirect all available power to engines and defensive systems." The order rippled through the fleet with the force of desperate hope. If they could reach the human fleet before their weapons failed completely, they might still be able to achieve victory through direct combat, where their superior individual ship capabilities could make the difference. "New course heading directly toward the human fleet," Admiral Rathard continued, her voice carrying the same implacable will that had driven Forshim expansion across 14 galaxies. All vessels will maintain maximum acceleration regardless of tactical considerations. We will close to point-blank range and destroy these male abominations with our remaining functional weapons." The implications of the order were not lost on anyone. The new course would take them dangerously close to the system's primary star, pushing their ships through radiation and gravitational fields that approached the limits of their design tolerances. But it was also the most direct route to the human fleet, and perhaps their only chance of turning the tide of battle. "Course correction acknowledged," came the response from thousands of ship captains who understood that this was likely their final gambit. All vessels accelerating to maximum velocity. Estimated time to human fleet engagement, 47 minutes. But even as the Forshim fleet adjusted course toward what might be their final battle, the human bomber formations continued their relentless assault. Without the distraction of defensive fire from capital ship weapons, the bombers were free to focus entirely on their systematic destruction of the largest and most critical targets. "The Mother's divine will is under concentrated attack," came another transmission. "Multiple bomber squadrons targeting our reactor housing. We can't hold them off without defensive fire." The capital ship, a vessel that had overseen the conquest of 3 star systems, began to show signs of critical damage as human torpedoes penetrated deep into its armored hull. Without the protective fire of its plasma cannons, the massive ship was helpless against the coordinated bomber assault. "Hull breach in the primary reactor compartment," came a panic transmission from the ship's damage control center. "Containment failure imminent. All hands prepare for emergency evacuation." The Mother's divine will died in nuclear fire, its reactor containment failing under sustained torpedo bombardment. The explosion was visible across half the battlefield, a testament to the devastating effectiveness of human weapons against ships that could no longer defend themselves. "Carrier Group 7 reporting total destruction," came another transmission. "All 4 carriers destroyed in the last 10 minutes. We've lost our fighter deployment capability in this entire sector." The systematic destruction of carrier assets continued as human bombers focused their attacks on the ships that provided fighter support. Each carrier that died reduced the fleet's ability to defend itself, creating a cascading failure that made subsequent attacks even more effective. "The righteous vengeance has been destroyed," came yet another report. "Direct torpedo hit to the command center. The ship broke apart in under 30 seconds. Doroni watched her tactical display with growing horror as red indicators marked the death of ship after ship. The fleet was hemorrhaging vessels at an unprecedented rate, their inability to provide defensive fire making them sitting targets for the human bomber formation. "Current capital ship losses approaching 35%, the tactical officer reported, her voice hollow with disbelief. "At current attrition rates, we'll lose half our remaining strength before we reach the human fleet." The human fighters and bombers pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency, their formations adapting constantly to exploit the gaps in Forshim defensive coverage. Without the suppressive fire of capital ship weapons, the bomber formations could approach their targets with impunity, delivering their devastating payloads with surgical precision. "Squadron 15 engaging human fighters," came a transmission from one of the few remaining Forshim interceptor groups. "We're outnumbered 8-1, requesting immediate support." But support was no longer available. The systematic destruction of carrier assets had reduced the fleet's fighter strength to a fraction of its original numbers, and those few interceptors that remained were being overwhelmed by the massive human formations that continued to launch from their distant fleet. "Multiple bomber formations targeting the Sacred Mother's wrath," came another panic transmission. "They're focusing on our engine sections. We're losing propulsion." The capital ship began to fall behind the main formation as human torpedoes systematically destroyed its drive systems. Without propulsion, the massive vessel became a stationary target for additional bomber waves, its fate sealed by its inability to maneuver or escape. The Forshim fleet pressed on toward their final confrontation, their ships dying around them as they raced toward what might be their only chance of victory. The course Admiral Rathhart had chosen would test their ships to their very limits, taking them through radiation fields and gravitational distortions that approached the threshold of survivability. but it was their only option. Ahead lay the human fleet, and beyond that, either victory or death with honor. The charge continued, driven by desperation, courage, and the unshakable conviction that the daughters of the First Mother would never surrender to male creatures. The acceleration was intoxicating. With all power redirected from weapons systems to the massive fusion drives, the Forshim fleet surged forward with a velocity that would have been impossible during normal combat operations. Ship after ship reported engine output levels approaching maximum theoretical capacity, their crews pushing every system beyond safe operating parameters in a desperate bid to close the distance with their tormentors. "Engine efficiency at 112%, Technical Officer Naranak called out, her voice carrying a note of excitement that had been absent for hours. "We're gaining velocity faster than projected. At this acceleration rate, we'll be within weapons range of the human fleet in 31 minutes. The tactical display aboard the Retribution's Edge showed the fleet formation stretching out like an arrow aimed at the heart of human space. Thousands of ships, their hulls scarred by battle damage and their crews driven by desperation, raced through space with the single-minded purpose of warriors who had found their target at last. "The human fleet is still retreating," weapons specialist Kanif reported, her instruments tracking the distant enemy vessels as they continued their strategic withdrawal. "But their acceleration curve is leveling off. We're closing the gap." For the first time since the battle began, Doroni felt a surge of hope. The humans had demonstrated superior tactics and innovative weapons, but they were still bound by the same laws of physics that governed all spacecraft. If the Forshim fleet could close to direct combat range, their superior individual ship capabilities might still carry the day. "Range to human fleet decreasing steadily," the sensor operator confirmed. "Current closure rate suggests weapons engagement in 28 minutes, assuming they maintain their current course and speed." Captain Jitara's voice crackled over the intercom with an enthusiasm that infected the entire crew. "Finally, after all their clever tricks and cowardly long-range attacks, we're going to get within striking distance. Prepare all functional weapons for maximum rate fire the moment we achieve range." Throughout the fleet, similar scenes of renewed hope were playing out, as ship captains realized they might yet achieve victory despite the devastating losses they had suffered. The human strategy of asymmetric warfare had been brutally effective, but it depended on maintaining distance and using mobile strike craft to avoid direct confrontation. "Fleet formation reporting successful acceleration," came Admiral Rathart's voice over the communication channels, her tone carrying the fierce satisfaction of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "All vessels maintain maximum velocity. We will close with the human fleet and destroy them at point-blank range, where their fighter advantage cannot save them." The Admiral's words were met with roars of approval from thousands of ship crews who had endured hours of devastating attack without being able to strike back effectively. The prospect of finally engaging their tormentors in direct combat where Forshim superiority in ship-to-ship warfare could assert itself was like oxygen to drowning warriors. "The human fleet appears to be having difficulty maintaining their withdrawal speed," came a report from the long-range sensors. "Their acceleration is definitely decreasing. We're gaining on them faster than anticipated." The news sent waves of excitement through the fleet as ship captains realized that the humans might not be able to maintain their evasive maneuvers indefinitely. Perhaps their ships had limitations that the Forshim fleet could exploit, weaknesses that could be turned against them in the coming engagement. But even as the fleet celebrated their improved tactical position, the growing presence of the system's primary star was becoming impossible to ignore. The massive fusion furnace dominated the forward view screens, its corona extending millions of canarths into space like grasping fingers of superheated plasma. "Stellar radiation levels increasing," Technical Officer Naranak reported, her instruments detecting the rising energy flux from their dangerous proximity to the star. "We're approaching the threshold of safe operating distance." The warning was echoed throughout the fleet as ship after ship reported similar readings. They were pushing the envelope of what their vessels could withstand, trading safety margins for the speed needed to catch their elusive enemy. Thermal management systems operating at maximum capacity, came a transmission from the heavy cruiser Divine Retribution. Temperature approaching critical levels, but we can maintain current course. The reports painted a picture of ships operating at the very edge of their design specifications, their crews accepting dangerous levels of radiation exposure and thermal stress in pursuit of their tactical objectives. It was the kind of calculated risk that defined Forshim military doctrine, achieving victory through superior courage and determination, even when the odds seemed impossible. Minor hull stress detected on decks 200 through 250, Naranak reported, her readings showing the early signs of thermal expansion in their ship's superstructure. Nothing critical yet, but we're definitely pushing our limits. But not all ships were weathering the stellar approach as well as the Retribution's edge. Throughout the fleet, vessels that had suffered significant battle damage were beginning to show signs of catastrophic failure, as the increased thermal load pushed their compromised systems beyond the breaking point. "This is the Sacred Honor," came a panic transmission from somewhere deep in the fleet formation. "Our damaged thermal management systems are failing, hull temperature critical and rising, we're losing structural integrity." The heavy cruiser, a vessel that had survived multiple torpedo impacts during the earlier bomber attacks, finally succumbed to the accumulated damage and thermal stress. Its hull began to buckle and crack as overheated metal expanded beyond its design tolerances, critical systems failing in cascade as the ship lost its battle against the star's relentless energy. "The Sacred Honor is breaking apart," came another transmission. "Hull breach cascade, all hands, abandon ship." The cruiser died not from enemy action but from the inexorable physics of their desperate gambit, its crew evacuating in whatever escape pods remained functional as their ship dissolved into expanding clouds of superheated debris. "We've lost the Sacred Honor to thermal failure," came the grim report from Fleet Coordination. "Total crew loss estimated at 4 billion souls." The death of the cruiser sent a chill through the fleet that had nothing to do with the vacuum of space. If ships with relatively minor battle damage were failing under the thermal stress, what would happen to vessels that had suffered more serious damage during the bomber attacks? "This is the Mother's Justice," came another desperate transmission, this one from a carrier that had lost most of its fighter bays to human torpedo strikes. "Our damaged sections are venting atmosphere. The heat is causing secondary explosions throughout our fighter storage areas." The carrier's compromised hull sections, weakened by battle damage and now subjected to thermal stress they were never designed to handle, began failing in spectacular fashion. Internal explosions lit up the ship's superstructure as stored fighter fuel and ammunition detonated under the combined pressure of vacuum exposure and thermal shock. "Mother's Justice reporting complete loss of structural integrity," came the carrier's final transmission. "We're abandoning ship. May the First Mother preserve us." The massive vessel began to come apart like a flower of destruction, its sections separating as internal explosions severed the connections between hull segments. Billions of crew members died in the space of seconds as their ship was consumed by the fires of its own stored weapons and fuel. But the worst fate was reserved for ships whose damage had compromised their propulsion systems. Unable to maintain the velocity needed to escape the star's gravitational influence, several vessels found themselves caught in a death spiral toward the stellar surface. "This is the righteous fire," came a transmission filled with desperate resignation. "Our damaged engines cannot maintain escape velocity. We're being drawn into the star. Tell Admiral Rathart that we died with honor." The destroyer, its drive systems crippled by earlier bomber attacks, fought a losing battle against gravitational forces that grew stronger with each passing moment. Its crew could only watch helplessly as their ship was inexorably pulled toward the stellar corona, their vessel's trajectory carrying them to a death that would leave no trace of their existence. "Righteous fire confirming loss of orbital stability," came the ship's final transmission, the captain's voice maintaining perfect military composure even in the face of certain death. "We commend our souls to the First Mother and our bodies to the sacred fires of this star." The destroyer vanished into the stellar corona like a mote of dust consumed by an inferno. Its matter instantly converted to energy as it merged with the star's fusion fires. The crew of 40 million warriors died in a flash of light that was barely visible against the star's overwhelming radiance. Multiple ships reporting gravitational distress, came a fleet-wide assessment from the Coordination Center. Vessels with compromised propulsion systems are at risk of stellar capture. Recommend immediate course correction to maintain safe distance. But Admiral Rathert's response was immediate and predictable, her voice carrying the implacable determination that had driven her species to conquest across 14 galaxies. "All ships maintain current course and velocity," she commanded, her words cutting through the growing concern about stellar proximity like a sword through silk. "Any vessel that cannot keep pace will be left behind. We will not allow the males to escape because some of our ships cannot handle the heat of true combat." The Admiral's orders were met with grim acceptance throughout the fleet. This was the Forshim way. Victory through superior courage and determination, even when the cost in lives was almost unimaginable. Better to die in pursuit of glory than to live with the shame of allowing male creatures to escape justice. Current fleet strength at 62% of original deployment, came the updated casualty assessment. But remaining vessels report maximum engine efficiency and optimal weapons readiness for the coming engagement. Despite the losses, the core of the fleet remained intact and operational. The ships that had survived the gauntlet of human attacks and stellar hazards were the strongest and most capable vessels in the formation, their crews seasoned by battle and driven by the prospect of finally engaging their tormentors in direct combat. It was then that the tactical situation shifted once again in a pattern that was becoming disturbingly familiar. The human fighter and bomber formations, which had been maintaining their relentless assault throughout the fleet's approach to the star, suddenly began executing coordinated withdrawal maneuvers. "Enemy fighters and bombers are disengaging," came a surprise transmission from one of the few remaining Forshim interceptor squadrons. "All formations pulling back toward the human fleet." The withdrawal was conducted with the same mechanical precision that had characterized all human military operations, their formations maintaining perfect coordination even as they accelerated away from the Forshim fleet toward their distant support vessels. "They're retreating again," weapons specialist Kynef observed, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "Just when we're about to get within range, they pull back their fighters." But Durrani was beginning to recognize the pattern. The humans weren't retreating, they were repositioning for another phase of their asymmetric warfare strategy. Every time the Forshim fleet thought they were gaining an advantage, the humans revealed another layer of their tactical prep. "Range to human fleet continuing to decrease," the sensor operator reported. "If they maintain current course, we'll achieve weapons lock in 14 minutes. The prospect of finally engaging the human capital ships in direct combat sent waves of anticipation through the fleet. After hours of being systematically destroyed by forces they couldn't reach, the Forshim warriors were eager to test their strength against enemies they could actually fight. "All functional weapons report ready status," Captain Jitara announced over the ship's communication system. "The moment we achieve range, we unleash everything we have left. Show these male creatures what happens when they face the daughters of the First Mother in honest combat." But even as the fleet prepared for what might be their final battle, the communication arrays crackled to life with an incoming transmission that carried the same maddening calm that had preceded every disaster in this engagement. "This is Grand Admiral Charles of the Human Defense Fleet," came the familiar voice, its measured cadence cutting through the background noise of overworked engines and emergency repairs with clinical precision. "I am transmitting final surrender terms to the Forshim invasion force." The transmission sent waves of rage through the fleet communication channels as thousands of ship captains reacted with predictable fury to another attempt at psychological manipulation by their male tormentor. "I offer you one final opportunity to withdraw from this system with the remnants of your fleet intact," Grand Admiral Charles continued, his voice carrying a note of what might have been genuine regret. This is your last chance to preserve the lives of your remaining crew members." Admiral Rathart's response was immediate and delivered with volcanic fury. "We will never surrender to diseased male creatures. We would rather die to the last warrior than accept terms from abominations like you." But Grand Admiral Charles' reply, when it came, carried an ominous certainty that sent chills through even the most dedicated Forshim warriors. "Then I am afraid you will do exactly that," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You will die to the last warrior, because what lies ahead will show no mercy to those who reject the final opportunity for honorable surrender." The transmission ended, leaving the Forshim fleet to contemplate the human admiral's words as they raced toward what might be their final confrontation. Behind them lay the wreckage of thousands of ships and the graves of billions of warriors. Ahead lay the human fleet and the answer to the question of whether courage and determination could overcome the most sophisticated military doctrine in galactic history. The charge continued, driven by honor, desperation, and the terrible knowledge that there was no longer any path except forward. The innermost planet had been nothing more than a footnote in the tactical assessments. A barren, airless rock, scorched by millennia of stellar radiation and dismissed as strategically irrelevant. Closer to the red dwarf than any world should be and still exist, it appeared to be little more than a ball of fused silicates and metals, baked sterile by its proximity to the star. The Forshim fleet had given it no more thought than they would any other piece of cosmic debris, their attention focused entirely on the distant human ships that represented their only hope of victory. Admiral Rathart's standing orders to conserve ammunition had meant that no ship wasted precious energy on targeting a world that posed no apparent threat. That oversight proved to be their final mistake. "Massive energy surge detected from the innermost planet," the sensor operator aboard the Retribution's Edge suddenly called out, her voice cracking with disbelief as her instruments registered readings that defied comprehension. "Power output equivalent to a stellar flare. Something is activating on the surface." Doroni spun toward her tactical display just in time to witness the impossible. The planet that had appeared dead and lifeless was suddenly blazing with energy signatures that dwarfed anything she had ever seen. Across its scorched surface, geometric patterns of light were spreading like circuit pathways coming online, turning the entire world into a massive technological construct. "That's not a planet," Technical Officer Naranak breathed, her instruments detecting artificial structures that spanned continents. "It's a machine. The entire world is some kind of artificial construct." The realization struck the fleet like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just weaponized an asteroid field. They had converted an entire planet into a weapon system so massive that its true nature had been invisible until the moment of activation. The engineering requirements alone were beyond comprehension, representing a level of technological capability that redefined what was possible in military construction. "Surface installations coming online across the entire planetary surface," came a panicked transmission from the destroyer Swift Vengeance. "Energy readings are off the scale. Whatever they built down there, it's bigger than anything we've ever encountered." The planet's transformation was visible to the naked eye, as brilliant lines of energy raced across its surface like veins of liquid fire. What had appeared to be natural terrain features revealed themselves as carefully constructed components of a weapon system that spanned an entire world. The scope of human preparation was becoming terrifyingly clear. They had spent years, perhaps decades, preparing for this exact scenario, but it was what happened next that sent waves of existential terror through the Forshim fleet. A section of the planet's surface, an area the size of a small continent, suddenly split apart like the petals of a mechanical flower. From within the planet's core, something emerged that defied every assumption about the limitations of weapons technology. It was a projectile of some kind, but one so massive and so brilliantly energized that it seemed like a captive star breaking free from its prison. "Object launch detected," the sensor operator screamed, her voice barely audible over the alarms that had begun blaring throughout the ship. Massive projectile accelerating from planetary surface, speed increasing exponentially. The weapon, for weapon it clearly was, streaked away from the planet with an acceleration curve that violated everything Duroni understood about physics and engineering. Whatever propulsion system the humans had developed, it was capable of accelerating a projectile the size of a capital ship to velocities that approached the fundamental speed limit of the universe. "Trajectory analysis incoming," Technical Officer Naranak called out, her instruments struggling to track something moving faster than their targeting computers were designed to handle. "The object is on a direct course for the primary star. Impact estimated in... By the first mother, it's moving at close to light speed." The implications struck Admiral Rathhart before anyone else, her tactical experience allowing her to understand what the humans had unleashed while others were still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the weapon. "All ships!" Her voice roared across the fleet communication channels with desperate urgency. "Emergency targeting on the planet and the projectile. Maximum firepower, everything we have. Stop that weapon before it reaches the star." The order rippled through the fleet with the speed of absolute terror. Every functional weapon system swung toward the racing projectile and its point of origin. Plasma cannons and particle beams and molecular disruptors all focusing their fury on targets that might already be beyond their ability to affect. "Firing!" Captain Jutara's voice cracked over the intercom as the Retribution's Edge added its weapons to the desperate barrage. "All weapons! Maximum power! Target the projectile first, then the planet!" The combined firepower of the remaining Forshim fleet created a light show that briefly rivaled the star itself. Hundreds of capital ships unleashed their remaining functional weapons in a concentrated barrage that should have been capable of destroying multiple worlds. Plasma streams hot enough to vaporize asteroids lanced through space toward the racing projectile, while particle beams that could core moons attempted to intercept something moving faster than most ships could even detect. "Direct hit on the projectile," Weapons Specialist Kniff called out triumphantly as her targeting display registered a successful weapons impact. "Plasma cannon strike confirmed," but the celebration was premature. The weapon that had emerged from the planet's core was not some fragile construct that could be destroyed by conventional weapons. The plasma stream that struck it simply dispersed harmlessly against some form of protective field, the projectile continuing its inexorable journey toward the star without any apparent damage. "No effect!" came a panicked transmission from the heavy cruiser Divine Wrath. "Our weapons aren't penetrating whatever shielding that thing has. It's still accelerating." More weapons found their mark as the fleet poured everything they had into stopping the mysterious projectile, but every impact simply dissipated against its protective barriers. Whatever the humans had launched, it was protected by defensive systems that made Forshim weapons technology seem primitive by comparison. "Target the planet," Admiral Rathhart commanded, her voice carrying the desperation of someone who understood that they were witnessing something that could change the fundamental nature of warfare. "If we can't stop the weapon, destroy its launch platform." The fleet's attention turned to the planet itself, their weapons seeking to destroy whatever installations had created the terrifying projectile. But even as plasma streams carved deep into the world's surface, the damage seemed insignificant compared to the massive scale of the weapon system. It was like trying to destroy a capital ship by shooting at individual hull plates. Technically possible, but practically meaningless given the time constraints they faced. Projectile impact with stellar corona in 30 seconds. Technical Officer Naranak reported, her voice tight with growing panic. "Whatever that thing is designed to do, we're about to find out." Duroni watched the tactical display with growing horror as the projectile completed its journey toward the star. Her instruments were damaged from hours of combat and the harsh radiation environment, but they were still functional enough to track something moving at such enormous velocity. "Estimated projectile velocity approaching 92% of light speed," she reported, her voice barely audible over the continuing weapons fire and emergency alarms. I've never seen anything accelerate that fast. The sensor readings were fragmentary and unreliable due to combat damage and stellar interference, but the basic facts were undeniable. The humans had somehow developed the technology to accelerate a massive projectile to relativistic velocities in a matter of seconds, then protect it with defensive fields that could withstand the combined firepower of hundreds of capital ships. "Impact imminent," came the countdown from sensors across the fleet. 10 seconds to stellar impact. The projectile struck the star's corona with the force of a directed supernova, its massive bulk and incredible velocity combining to create an impact that registered on instruments throughout the star system. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The star continued its fusion processes as if nothing had occurred, its surface showing no immediate signs of change. Then the communication arrays across the fleet crackled to life one final time, with the voice that had haunted them throughout this engagement. "This is Grand Admiral Charles of the Human Defense Fleet," came the familiar, measured tone, but now it carried a note of what might have been genuine solemnity. "To those who are about to die, we salute you." The transmission was brief, almost ceremonial in its delivery, but the words carried a weight of finality that sent chills through every warrior who heard them. It was the kind of farewell that civilizations offered to worthy opponents before delivering the killing blow. "What have they done?" Weapons Specialist Kniff whispered, her instruments detecting the first signs of change in the star's energy output. What was that weapon designed to accomplish? The answer, Doroni realized with growing horror, was about to become devastatingly clear. The humans had not just built a weapon. They had built something capable of affecting the fundamental processes of stellar fusion. And if they could manipulate a star's behavior, the tactical display began registering the first signs of change in the red dwarf's energy output. Subtle fluctuations that suggested something fundamental had been altered in the star's core processes. Whatever the humans had launched into their sun, it was beginning to have effects that would soon become impossible to ignore. The Forshim fleet raced through space toward their final confrontation, but now they carried the terrible knowledge that their enemy possessed weapons capable of manipulating the very forces that powered stellar systems. The tactical display aboard the Retribution's Edge suddenly registered something that defied every assumption Doroni had made about human military capabilities. The distant human fleet, which had been maintaining its strategic withdrawal for hours, had come to a complete stop in space. "Human fleet has ceased acceleration," the sensor operator reported, her voice carrying confusion at this unexpected development. "All enemy capital ships are holding position at maximum range." The change in human behavior was so sudden and unexpected that it sent ripples of uncertainty through the Forshim fleet. After hours of careful maneuvering and tactical withdrawal, why would the humans suddenly abandon their mobility advantage and present stationary targets? "They're finally going to stand and fight," Captain Jatera observed with grim satisfaction. "Perhaps they've realized that their cowardly tactics can't save them forever." But Doroni was studying her sensor readings with growing unease. Something about the human fleet's behavior suggested this wasn't a tactical decision born of desperation or courage. It felt more like the methodical preparation for something that required precise positioning and timing. "Captain," she called out, her voice tight with apprehension, "I'm detecting unusual energy signatures from the human vessels. Their power output patterns are unlike anything we've observed during this engagement." Before Captain Jatera could respond, the tactical situation shifted again in a way that rendered all previous assumptions meaningless. The human capital ships began to vanish. Not destroyed, vanished. One moment they were there on the display, massive signatures representing some of the largest warships Doroni had ever encountered. The next moment, empty space where whole fleets had been positioned. "Multiple human ships are disappearing from sensors," the operator called out, her voice rising to near panic levels. "I'm losing contact with entire formations. They're just gone." "Cloaking technology?" Captain Jatera suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. The Forshim had encountered various forms of stealth systems in their galactic conquests, but nothing that could make capital ships simply disappear from sensors without any trace of their passage. Negative on cloaking, Deroni reported, her instruments detecting none of the telltale signatures that usually accompanied invisibility fields or sensor jammers. This is something else entirely. They're not hiding. They're actually leaving. The realization struck her with devastating force as she recognized what she was witnessing. The humans were using some form of faster-than-light travel that bore no resemblance to the hyperspace technology that the original intelligence reports had described. Instead of the complex jump calculations and extended acceleration phases that characterized known FTL systems, the human ships were simply departing. It's a completely unknown FTL technology, she breathed, her instruments tracking the last few human capital ships as they prepared to follow their companions into whatever dimensional space they used for travel. Nothing like the hyperspace drives in our intelligence briefings. But what happened next challenged every assumption about the limitations of FTL technology. The human fighter and bomber formations, the small craft that had been systematically destroying the Forshim fleet for hours, began executing the same mysterious departure sequence as their capital ships. "The fighters are jumping too," Technical Officer Naranak called out in disbelief. "Single-seat craft are making independent FTL transitions. That should be impossible." The sight of individual fighters disappearing into faster-than-light travel violated everything Deroni understood about the physics and engineering requirements of FTL systems. The power requirements alone should have made it impossible for craft smaller than cruiser-class vessels to generate their own jump fields. Yet she was watching fighters execute FTL jumps with the same ease as capital ships. "How are they doing this?" Weapons Specialist Kenyef whispered, her instruments detecting the energy signatures of hundreds of individual FTL transitions as the human strike craft followed their motherships into whatever dimensional space they used for travel. Within moments, the tactical display that had shown thousands of human vessels was virtually empty. The massive fleet that had systematically dismantled the most powerful military force in galactic history had simply vanished, leaving behind only empty space and the growing realization that humanity possessed technological capabilities that exceeded their wildest estimates. But not everything had departed. Scattered throughout the battle space, small objects remained, objects that Deroni's sensors were having difficulty classifying due to combat damage and stellar interference. "Contacts remaining in the operational area," the sensor operator reported. "Unable to classify due to sensor limitations, but they appear to be much smaller than the departed fighters." The drone escorts, Deroni realized with growing dread. They left the drones behind. The implication struck her like a physical blow. If the humans had evacuated their personnel but left their automated systems in place, it suggested they were expecting something to happen that would be unsurvivable for living beings, but might be weathered by properly shielded artificial constructs. Why would they leave drones behind unless... Captain Jutara began, but her words were cut off by alarms that began blaring throughout the ship. "Massive energy surge from the primary star!" Technical Officer Naranak screamed, her instruments detecting changes in stellar output that registered beyond the upper limits of her equipment. "The star is destabilizing. Whatever that weapon did, it's working." The red dwarf that had provided heat and light to this system for billions of years was beginning to die in a manner that violated every principle of stellar physics. The projectile that had struck its corona was somehow affecting the fundamental fusion processes in its core, creating a cascade failure that would shortly result in stellar collapse. "Estimated time to stellar detonation," Captain Jutara demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos of emergency alerts and panic communications from across the fleet. "Unknown," came the reply. "The stellar physics models don't account for artificial interference with fusion processes. The star could explode in minutes or seconds." It was Captain Jitara who grasped the full implications first, her tactical experience allowing her to understand what the humans had accomplished while others were still struggling to process the magnitude of the threat. "All hands, prepare for emergency hyperspace transition," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that the next few seconds would determine whether her crew lived or died. "Emergency jump coordinates, any vector that takes us away from this system." "Captain," Durrani called out, her voice tight with understanding. "The humans knew this was coming. That's why they evacuated. They've turned the entire star into a weapon." The realization that they had been lured into a star system that was itself a massive bomb sent waves of terror through the crew. The humans hadn't just built weapons capable of destroying fleets. They had developed the technology to weaponize stellar objects themselves. "Hyperspace drive charging," came the report from the engineering section. 30 seconds to jump readiness." But 30 seconds might be 29 seconds too long. Across the fleet, Admiral Rathart's flagship was still trying to organize a coordinated response to the threat, her communication systems overwhelmed by panicked reports from ships whose crews were beginning to understand the true scope of their predicament. "Admiral Rathart is ordering all ships to maintain formation and attempt coordinated withdrawal," came a transmission from Fleet Command. "Prepare for synchronized hyperspace departure in 60 seconds. "We don't have 60 seconds, Captain Jitara snarled, her tactical instincts screaming that every moment of delay decreased their chances of survival. "The star could detonate at any moment." The stellar energy output was climbing exponentially, the red dwarf's normally stable fusion processes transforming into something that resembled the early stages of a nova event. Whatever the humans had done to the star's core was accelerating processes that should have taken millions of years and compressing them into minutes. "Hyperspace drive ready," came the urgent report from engineering. "We can jump immediately." Captain Jitara made a decision that would save her ship and crew, even as it violated every principle of fleet coordination and military discipline. "Execute jump immediately. Navigation any vector that takes us away from this star." "But the Admiral's orders," the navigation officer began. "The Admiral is about to be vaporized, along with anyone stupid enough to wait for coordinated withdrawal." Captain Jitara cut him off. "Execute the jump now." The Retribution's edge translated into hyperspace just as the red dwarf finally succumbed to the artificial interference with its fusion processes. The star that had burned steadily for billions of years exploded with the force of a directed supernova, its death throes releasing enough energy to sterilize every world in the system. Through the transparent aluminum of the bridge viewports, Durrani caught a glimpse of Admiral Rathart's flagship, the Eternal Empress, as it was consumed by the expanding wave of stellar destruction. The massive vessel, which had overseen the conquest of entire galaxies, simply ceased to exist as the star's death converted matter and energy into an expanding sphere of annihilation. "Jump successful," the navigation officer reported, as the ship translated into the alternate dimensional space that allowed faster-than-light travel. "We're clear of the system," but their relief was premature. Within moments of entering hyperspace, every alarm on the ship began blaring simultaneously, as their instruments detected something that should have been impossible. "The stellar explosion is affecting hyperspace," Technical Officer Naranak screamed, her readouts showing dimensional distortions that threatened to tear their ship apart. "The energy release is somehow propagating through multiple dimensions." The implications were terrifying beyond comprehension. If the weaponized star's explosion could affect hyperspace itself, then no ship within range would be safe, regardless of their dimensional position. The humans had somehow developed technology that could weaponize stellar objects in ways that transcended normal space-time limitations. "We're being pulled back into normal space," the navigation officer called out as their hyperspace field began to collapse under the pressure of forces that existed outside conventional physics. "Emergency translation imminent." The Retribution's edge was torn from hyperspace by energies that reached across dimensional barriers. their ship tumbling back into normal space with violent force that threw crew members against bulkheads and overloaded systems throughout the vessel. "Impact alert!" came a panic transmission from the sensor station. "Large gravitational mass directly ahead. We're on collision course with a planetary body." Through the bridge viewports, Doroni could see the cratered surface of a moon rushing toward them with terrifying speed. Their emergency translation from hyperspace had deposited them in the outer reaches of the star system, but their uncontrolled exit had left them on a collision trajectory with one of the gas giant's natural satellites. "Emergency engines," Captain Jitara commanded, but the response from engineering was immediate and devastating. "Propulsion systems offline," came the reply. "Hyperspace translation failure caused massive system overloads. We have no engine power." The ship struck the moon's surface with enough force to create a crater visible from orbit, their impact sending shockwaves through the small world's crust as thousands of tons of Forshim warship buried itself in ancient regolith. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the ship as primary power systems struggled to come online after the devastating crash. "Damage report," Captain Jitara called out, her voice carrying the strain of someone who had just witnessed the destruction of everything she had ever believed in. "Multiple hull breaches sealed by emergency systems," came the response from damage control. "Casualties throughout the ship, but life support is stable. We're alive, but we're not going anywhere." Through the cracked viewports of the bridge, Doroni could see the gas giant hanging in space above them like a malevolent eye. But it was what lay beyond the massive planet that filled her with existential dread. The expanding wavefront of the stellar explosion was racing toward them at a significant fraction of light speed, a wall of destruction that would arrive within minutes. The weaponized star's death was so violent that its effects were propagating through normal space faster than most ships could travel, turning the entire star system into an expanding sphere of annihilation. "The blast wave is approaching," Technical Officer Naranak reported, her voice hollow with the acceptance of inevitable death. "Impact with this moon in approximately 4 minutes." Around them, a few other ships that had managed to escape the initial destruction were visible on the moon's surface. Fellow survivors who had been torn from hyperspace by the same dimensional distortions that had claimed the Retribution's edge. But their numbers were pitifully small. Compared to the thousands of vessels that had begun this engagement, the survivors of the most powerful military force in galactic history sat on a barren moon and watched the expanding wall of stellar destruction approach. Their ships broken and their fleet annihilated by an enemy that had demonstrated technological capabilities beyond their wildest nightmares. The blast wave of the weaponized star grew larger and brighter as it approached, carrying with it the death of a solar system and the end of foreseen dreams of galactic conquest. The few surviving ships scattered across the moon's cratered surface presented a tableau of devastation that would have been unimaginable just hours before. Where once the most powerful military force in galactic history had swept through space with the confidence of inevitable conquest, now only broken hulks remained. Perhaps a dozen vessels out of the thousands that had begun this engagement, their crews trapped on an alien world with death approaching from multiple directions. Through the damaged viewports of the Retribution's edge, Doroni could see the twisted wreckage of other ships that had shared their fate. The heavy cruiser Divine Vengeance lay on its side nearly 1,000 canarths away, its hull split open like a broken egg with debris scattered across hundreds of canarths of lunar regolith. Closer to their position, the destroyer Sacred Duty had buried its forward section so deeply in the moon's surface that only its engine nacelles remained visible above ground. "Casualty reports coming in from across the ship," Technical Officer Naranak announced, her voice strained by the magnitude of their losses. "Initial impact killed approximately 40% of our crew. Medical stations are overwhelmed with survivors suffering from impact trauma and radiation exposure." The bridge crew worked at their stations with the mechanical efficiency of professionals who understood that duty continued, even in the face of certain death. Their instruments painted a picture of systematic failure throughout the ship. Hull breaches sealed by emergency bulkheads, power systems operating on backup capacity, and life support systems struggling to maintain atmospheric pressure against the alien environment outside. Structural integrity assessment indicates the ship will remain pressurized for approximately 6 hours under normal conditions, came a report from the engineering section. However, we're detecting atmospheric contamination from the moon's environment, wherever hull breaches have occurred. Captain Jatara studied the damage reports with the grim determination of someone who refused to surrender to despair, even when faced with impossible circumstances. What's our tactical situation? Are any of our weapon systems functional? Limited weapons capability restored, weapons specialist Kanif replied, her fingers dancing across control panels that flickered with intermittent power failures. 2 plasma cannons operational, but targeting systems are severely degraded. We could engage point targets at close range, but our fire control is essentially worthless. It was then that the tactical display registered new contacts, small, fast-moving objects that were approaching the crash sites with purposeful vectors that suggested hostile intent. Multiple small craft approaching from various vectors, the sensor operator reported, her voice carrying a note of disbelief at what her instruments were detecting. Configuration matches the drone escorts that remained behind after the human fleet departed. The implications struck Doroni like a physical blow. The human battle drones, the small autonomous craft that had provided escort services for the fighter and bomber formations, were moving to engage the surviving Forshim ships. Even with the stellar blast wave approaching and death certain for all involved, the mechanical constructs were apparently programmed to continue their mission of destruction. "They are going to attack us," she breathed, the words carrying a horror that transcended physical fear. "Even knowing that the blast wave will destroy everything in this system within minutes, those machines are still trying to kill us." The first drone attack came without warning or tactical coordination. A sleek, angular craft no larger than a fighter swooped down toward the wreckage of the Divine Vengeance, its weapons already charging as it lined up for a strafing run against the helpless capital ship. "The Divine Vengeance is under attack," came a panicked transmission over the emergency communication frequencies. "Human drone engaging with plasma weapons. We have no functional defenses." The drone's weapons fire carved deep into the cruiser's exposed hull sections, its plasma beams designed not for maximum destruction, but for methodical, systematic damage to critical systems. Rather than attempting to destroy the ship quickly, the autonomous craft seemed intent on ensuring that any survivors aboard would die slowly as their life support systems failed. "Multiple drones converging on the sacred duty," came another transmission, this one from the buried destroyer whose crew was trapped in the sections that remained above ground. "They're targeting our remaining atmospheric processors. They're trying to suffocate us." More drones joined the attack, their formations displaying the same mechanical precision that had characterized all human military operations. But there was something particularly horrifying about watching autonomous machines methodically execute survivors who posed no possible threat to their departed creators. "Why are they doing this?" Technical Officer Naranak whispered, her instruments tracking the drone formations as they spread out across the crash sites like mechanical vultures. "The blast wave will kill everyone in 4 minutes. Why waste energy on attacking survivors?" Captain Jatara's response carried the bitter understanding of someone who had finally grasped the true nature of their enemy. Because they're machines. They don't feel satisfaction or mercy or the desire for honorable combat. They're programmed to kill Forshim warriors, and they'll continue that programming until they're destroyed or their targets are eliminated. The psychological horror of the situation was almost worse than the physical threat. To die in honest combat against a worthy enemy was one thing, but to be hunted by mindless machines while trapped on an alien world added layers of existential terror that pushed beyond the boundaries of rational fear. "Drone formation approaching our position," the sensor operator announced, her voice tight with the strain of impending combat. 3 contacts. Attack vector suggests they're targeting our life support systems." The first drone to reach their crash site swooped low over the Retribution's edge, its weapons already tracking critical systems with mechanical precision. Plasma beams lanced down from the small craft, carving deep into the ship's superstructure as the autonomous hunters sought to eliminate the trapped crew with methodical efficiency. "Return fire," Captain Jatara commanded, her voice carrying the fury of a warrior who refused to die passively even in the face of overwhelming odds. The ship's remaining weapons swiveled toward the attacking drone, their targeting system struggling to lock on to such a small, fast-moving target. When the plasma cannons finally fired, their energy streams passed harmlessly through empty space as the drone executed evasive maneuvers that demonstrated reaction times no living pilot could match. "Target destroyed," Weapons Specialist Canif suddenly called out in triumph as their second volley found its mark, the drone exploding in a brief flash of light as its power systems overloaded. But the victory was meaningless in the context of their broader situation. Two more drones immediately moved to replace their destroyed companion, their weapons seeking the same critical systems with the same mechanical persistence. "Hull breach in Section 12, came a panic report from damage control. "Drone weapons fire has penetrated our emergency atmospheric seals. We're losing pressure." The attacks continued with relentless efficiency as more drones joined the assault on the crash sites. Each autonomous craft was programmed with detailed knowledge of Forshim ship design, allowing them to target the most critical systems with surgical precision. They weren't trying to create spectacular explosions. They were methodically ensuring that anyone who had survived the crash would die slowly and inevitably. But the drone attacks, horrifying as they were, represented only one of the threats facing the survivors. As damage control teams rushed to seal the new hull breaches, they began reporting atmospheric readings that sent chills through the command crew. "The air outside is highly corrosive," Technical Officer Naranak announced, her instruments analyzing samples of the moon's atmosphere that had entered through damaged hull sections. Complex hydrofluoric and sulfuric acid compounds in gaseous form. Exposure would cause massive tissue damage within seconds. The moon they had crashed on was not just barren, it was actively hostile to life. Its thin atmosphere was a toxic cocktail of industrial solvents and acids that would dissolve organic tissue as efficiently as any weapon. Every hull breach that allowed the alien air to enter their ship was slowly poisoning the atmosphere that kept them alive. Atmospheric contamination spreading through ventilation systems, came a report from life support. "We're detecting acid vapor infiltration in multiple compartments. Crew members are reporting respiratory distress and chemical burns." The reports painted a picture of systematic poisoning as the moon's corrosive atmosphere worked its way through their damaged ship. Where drone weapons had failed to create immediate death, the alien environment was accomplishing the same goal through chemical warfare that required no conscious direction. "Emergency atmospheric processors online," came an update from engineering. "But we're fighting a losing battle. The contamination is spreading faster than we can neutralize it." It was then that the most horrifying reports began filtering up from the lower sections of the ship, the areas that had been driven deepest into the moon's surface during their violent impact. "Engineering to bridge," came a transmission that carried overtones of panic barely held in check. "We've got a major problem in the lower hull sections. The ship's impact created fractures in the moon's crust, and we're detecting massive thermal signatures below our position." "Clarify your report," Captain Jatara demanded, though her voice suggested she was beginning to understand what they had discovered. "The moon is volcanically active," came the reply. "Our impact fractured the crust above a magma chamber, and molten rock is now flooding into our lowest compartments. We've lost contact with everyone below Deck 50. The implication struck the bridge crew with devastating force. The moon's surface might be cold and toxic, but beneath its cratered exterior lay a molten core that was now breaching their ship through the very impact craters their crash had created. Those crew members who had survived the initial impact and were trapped in the lower sections were now facing death by molten rock. "How much time before the lava reaches critical systems?" Captain Jatara asked, her tactical mind automatically calculating their remaining operational window. "At current flow rates, approximately 20 minutes before magma reaches the main reactor compartment," came the grim response. "But we're already losing life support systems as the heat rises through the ship." The reports from the lower levels painted a picture of systematic destruction as superheated rock flowed through corridors that had once housed thousands of crew members. Emergency bulkheads sealed automatically as temperature sensors detected the approach of molten lava. But each sealed compartment trapped additional survivors who would die as the heat rose and their local life support failed. Deck 47 reports critical temperature rise, came one transmission. "Emergency evacuation in progress, but we're running out of places to retreat to." Deck 33, confirming lava breach in the port section, came another. "All personnel evacuated to emergency stations, but the heat is making those compartments uninhabitable." The surviving crew members were being compressed into an ever-shrinking area of habitable space as molten rock claimed the lower sections and toxic atmosphere infiltrated the upper levels. They were being slowly cooked from below while being poisoned from above, their ship transforming into a death trap that offered no avenue of escape. "Thermal management systems are overloading," Technical Officer Naranak reported, her instruments detecting dangerous heat buildup throughout the ship's superstructure. "The lava flow is raising our internal temperature beyond safe operating limits. We're going to start losing critical systems within minutes." Through the cracked viewports, Doroni could see similar scenes playing out across the other crash sites. Smoke was beginning to rise from the wreckage of the Sacred Duty as thermal damage claimed that ship's systems, while the Divine Vengeance showed signs of internal fires as its crew struggled with the same combination of toxic atmosphere and rising temperatures. The drone attacks continued throughout the thermal crisis, the autonomous craft showing no concern for their own survival as they methodically ensured the destruction of any Forshim survivors. Several drones had been destroyed by defensive fire or by flying too close to ships that were venting superheated gases, but more continued to arrive as if summoned by some central coordination system. "Life support efficiency down to 60% and falling," came a report from Environmental Systems. "The combination of atmospheric contamination and thermal stress is overwhelming our processing capacity." The air inside the ship was becoming thick and acrid as filtration systems struggled to remove both the corrosive gases seeping in from outside and the toxic smoke rising from the lower levels where organic materials were being consumed by intense heat. Crew members throughout the ship were beginning to show signs of chemical poisoning and heat exhaustion. "Medical stations report massive casualty increases," came an update from the ship's medical officer. "Chemical burns from atmospheric exposure, heat stroke from rising temperatures, and respiratory distress from toxic smoke inhalation. We don't have the resources to treat everyone." The systematic failure of life support systems created a cascade of medical emergencies that overwhelmed their limited treatment capabilities. Crew members who had survived the initial crash and the drone attacks were now dying from environmental hazards that no amount of courage or determination could overcome. "Bridge, this is engineering," came a transmission that carried the finality of absolute despair. "Magma has reached the main reactor compartment. We're initiating emergency shutdown protocols, but once the reactor goes offline, we'll lose all power, including life support." The loss of their main reactor would effectively end any hope of survival, even for the few minutes that remained before the stellar blast wave arrived. Without power, their atmospheric processors would fail, their emergency lighting would die, and their communication systems would go silent. "Estimated time to reactor shutdown?" Captain Jatara asked, her voice maintaining professional composure even as her ship died around her. 12 minutes to complete power failure," came the reply, "but thermal damage to critical systems will begin causing cascading failures within 5 minutes. Through the failing viewports, the expanding wavefront of the stellar explosion was clearly visible now, a wall of destruction that seemed to fill half the sky as it raced toward them with the inevitability of physics. The weaponized star's death was so violent that its light was visible across interstellar distances, turning the night sky into a brilliant aurora of annihilation. 2 minutes to blast wave impact," Technical Officer Naranak announced, her voice carrying the strange calm that sometimes accompanied acceptance of inevitable death. The drones were still attacking, their weapons still carving into the dying ships with mechanical persistence that continued even as their own destruction approached. They showed no concern for the expanding wall of stellar fire that would vaporize everything in the system. They were machines, and machines followed their programming until the moment they ceased to function. "Hull breach in the bridge section," Weapons Specialist Kanif called out as corrosive atmosphere began streaming into their command center. "Emergency seals are failing." The acrid alien air burned their lungs and eyes as it mixed with the ship's atmosphere, adding chemical poisoning to the heat stress and radiation exposure that was already claiming lives throughout the vessel. Through the breached hull sections, they could see the cratered surface of the moon and the brilliant light of approaching destruction. 1 minute to impact, came the final countdown, broadcast across all emergency frequencies as the few surviving ships prepared to meet their end. The stellar blast wave filled the sky like the approach of an angry god, its leading edge bright enough to burn retinas and hot enough to vaporize solid matter. The weaponized star's destruction had created forces that exceeded anything in natural stellar evolution, turning death into a phenomenon that transcended normal physics. Captain Jatara's voice carried across the ship's failing communication system one final time, her words offering the only comfort available to warriors facing annihilation. "All hands, this is the captain. It has been my honor to serve alongside the finest crew in the Forshim fleet. We die as we lived, as daughters of the First Mother, unbroken by our enemies." The blast wave struck the moon with the force of a directed supernova, instantly vaporizing the surface and everything on it. The Retribution's edge and its crew simply ceased to exist, their matter converted to energy and atoms in the space of microseconds as stellar forces consumed the small world. The drones died with their targets, their mechanical persistence finally ended by destruction so complete that no trace remained of either hunter or prey. The moon itself was reduced to expanding clouds of superheated plasma, its mass scattered across the star system as the weaponized stellar explosion continued its expansion toward the system's outer reaches. The most powerful military force in galactic history had been utterly annihilated by an enemy that had demonstrated technological capabilities beyond imagination, their destruction so complete that no survivors remained to carry word of what humanity had become. In the expanding sphere of stellar destruction, the Forshim dream of galactic conquest died with its warriors, leaving only silence and the terrible knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy, the males had learned to make stars into weapons. Many thanks to channel member J.O. for making this video possible. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave this video a like and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. Video shares, memberships, and super thanks help the channel grow as well, so feel free to partner with this channel in that way as we grow. With that all said, thank you again for listening to the story, and thank you for your time. On the left side of your screen are some videos I think you might be interested in. I hope to see you in the next one.